You know, one of these days, I really am going to submit this school project. Guess it's time for our 500th episode here on Motorsport 101. I still can't quite wrap my head around this. Welcome to the 500th episode of Motorsport 101. My goodness me, what a journey it's been. From the very first episode we did back in October of 2014, that's in tribute of a weird thing. It was the 2014 Russian Grand Prix, the very first Russian Grand Prix. And so now here we are, sat in, just as we start our 2024 F1 season almost a decade later, here we are for the 500th time talking about good, but in this case, we're going to be a little bit self-indulgent when we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing in a minute. But first, introducing our esteemed guest who's been here for over half of those 500 episodes in total, Mr. RJ O'Connell. How's it going, big man?
You know, Dre, I really think that this is a little bit too long for a one-off guest appearance.
you may be onto something here. We've just kind of stuck with it, really, haven't we?
Maybe one day I'll get back to that, looking for work as a semi-professional voiceover artist.
Maybe one day I'll go back to the bookies. Who knows? It's weird how these things fly over time. But to be fair, I wasn't even in the bookies back then. 10 years ago, I was in a Matalan. I was in a department store checking and opening boxes for a living. And while this was just a final year university project, it's the number one moment on our list of our own preconceived idea for our 500th episode, the 50 most important moments in Motorsport 101 history, as you've probably already gathered from the title. But we'll get into that full list in a little bit. We do still annoyingly have to clean up a little bit of the news before we get cracking on the list.
That's right. And it's FIA President Mohammed bin Sulayem who's in the news for a couple of things, as reported by Andrew Benson over at BBC Sport. The first thing came out back about a day or two ago, that he's under investigation for allegedly interfering over a Formula One race result, specifically intervening to overturn a penalty given to Fernando Alonso at the 2023 Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Now, if you'll recall, during that race, Alonso was given a 10-second penalty for work done on his car while he was serving a previous 5-second penalty. The report by compliance officer Paolo Bassari says that the whistleblower who reported that Ben Sulayem, quote, pretended the stewards to overturn their decision to issue the penalty to Alonso. In Italian, the word pretendere means to require respect. The penalty in question had dropped Alonso from third place behind Sergio Perez and Max Verstappen to fourth, also behind George Russell, withdrawing it, returned him to a podium position. I remember that this was very controversial at the time because it looked like they had served the 5 seconds before they went to touch the car the first time. Because Aston Martin had to lodge their right to review to basically appeal that second penalty. We basically had 3 different results before it was final. The final result we got from Saudi Arabia, because it turns out Aston Martin pulled out a whole bunch of evidence saying, well, this rule has not been basically enforced consistently over the years since its inception. And the stewards were like, you know what, fair enough. If that's the case, we got to reverse it. And they did. Now we know that there is an allegation that the stewards might have had some, shall we say, external influence on this, which I don't think needs to be said is a potentially horrible look for FIA President Mohammed bin Sulayem. Oh, don't worry. It gets worse, because from this same whistleblower who blew the first case comes a story that broke earlier today alleging that he told FIA officials not to certify the Las Vegas street circuit for its race last November. Now, if this had been done like in the build up to the race, I think a lot of F1 media pundits, people in the sport, would be ready to hand this man the Nobel Peace Prize on a silver platter personally. The whistleblower says they were told on behest of the FIA president to find a way to not pass the circuit, not safe for racing. The report quotes the whistleblower saying they were contacted by their manager, who, on behalf of the FIA president, instructed him to find some concerns to prevent the FIA from certifying the circuit before the weekend of the race. The compliant report quotes the whistleblower saying that the purpose was to find fault with the track in order to withhold the license. It adds, asked to be more specific, the whistleblower said that issues on the circuit were meant to be artificially identified regardless of their actual existence, with the ultimate goal of withholding the license. The whistleblower said they tasked an official with performing this task and named 2 further officials who were in the room at the time. The report adds that the officials were, quote, unable to find any concerns with the circuit and therefore certified the circuit fit for the race. So what's crazy in all this is that there was a track inspection that was engineered for it to fail. It passed, and then a manhole cover shot through Carlos Sainz Jr.'s car.
Oh dear God in heaven! What on earth is this? It's like this. This is just coming off that Ben Sulayem is a meddler, a big-time meddler that is seemingly out-kicking his coverage. You know, like, this is straight out of some sort of action movie villain's plot. Set up a track inspection that a track was doomed to fail, figure out the track passes it anyway, and then we almost lose Carlos Sainz in a horrifyingly scary drain cover explosion underneath his car that misses his seat by inches. Holy shit. And yeah, salute to Andrew Benson, who's been pushing both these reports on BBC Sport regarding Formula One in the last couple of days. He's been putting in work to get these 2 stories out there. The FIA in the last few minutes is literally in the last hour before we've recorded this episode have acknowledged the report as basically genuine, and they're looking into it. We expect to get a review on that sometime in April, according to Benson's original report, on the first half of this story in regards to the Saudi Arabian interference of last year. They reckon it's going to be a 4 to 6 week process with the ethics committee. Again, this is a horrible look for Ben Sulayem. I mean, the one thing that Ben Sulayem, generally speaking, gets a bad rap for was Abu Dhabi 2021, which wasn't even his fault because he wasn't even FIA president when this happened.
He just took the job.
He just literally got on the job, and his first role immediately was to clean up the mess that the stewards and John Todd in combination had left for him in arguably the most hot-bedded title finale F1 had seen in probably 25 years. I generally think he did quite a good job cleaning that up. He got Mercedes to ultimately stand down. There was big reform to the stewarding process. And the FIA was pretty transparent about its own shortcomings as a governing body as a direct result. I thought this was all good steps for the most part, but there's just been scandal after scandal with Ben Sulayem, and sketchy story after sketchy story with him in the just over 2 years he's been president. They just keep racking up. You know, last year he came out on Twitter saying that no, the Saudis buying F1 wouldn't be a good idea, and I think he was ultimately right about that. But even so, F1 lawyered up, sent him a cease and desist, and within days he's having to stand down from day-to-day F1 running. He opened the floodgates to Andretti coming into the sport potentially, and again, that's led to somewhat of a civil war between them and Formula One. There was the blog site he used to have that was riddled with sexist comments saying that women shouldn't be able to think they're smarter than men. There's been story after story with Ben Sulayem. He just cannot keep himself quiet since becoming president, and I'm deeply concerned that if this turns out to be true, what happens then? Are we getting a vote of no confidence here?
thinking it may head down that road. And given what we know that Mohammed bin Sulayem was never everybody's first choice for FIA president, and he got elected anyway, it makes me think that if there's a vote of no confidence, this guy's not going to be long for his job.
Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of think that this job is a poisoned chalice in general.
Like, there's, being in charge of the governing body that has to maintain Formula One, which is not the nicest sport to have to govern and manage, in the amount of egos, power trips, stakeholders, and parties involved in trying to keep them all happy. I don't envy anyone in that job. It is a nearly impossible job. We've seen the very ugly side of Formula One politics time and time again, and we'll be talking about it on our list very, very shortly, inevitably, as we go for our list of moments. So I do have a degree of empathy for Mohammed bin Sulayem, because it's not a straightforward job, and he had a bold manifesto. His manifesto talked at length about trying to make the FIA run a profit for the first time ever, trying to get them out of the red. Talking about trying to increase diversity and participation on a youth and grassroots motorsport level, which, to be fair, he has done to some degree. He's tried to tackle online abuse as well, which is something that I think the sport also badly needs in general. He's done a lot of genuinely good work that I think is not going to get acknowledged anywhere near as much as the obvious and deserved scandal that has come with his tenure as well, that we're also going to talk about. And this is a big one. You cannot, as the president of a governing body, effectively rig a race. That's the biggest of no-nos. That's the one thing that he unfairly got done for in 2021, and he might be guilty of the exact same thing. It's completely unacceptable. If this is true, of course. We got to give him every benefit of the doubt here until this trial and ethics committee investigation concludes. But if he's found guilty of this, I'm not sure his position is tenable, RJ.
I don't think so either. We're just going to have to wait and see how that goes. Formula One, obviously, not a lot of intrigue on track. Maybe search for the support races for that. On the track, off the track, should say. Dude, it's way too much. But now, I think it's time, Dre. Yes, sadly, this is the moment in an anime where we need to have a flashback episode, because we're catching up way too quickly to the manga adaptation, and we've got to start baking in some time. So we're going to have a flashback episode, our 500th episode of Motorsport 101. And I thought about it. I was just thinking, what do we do for 500 episodes? Mm-hmm. What do we do? And the idea was very cliched, but I think it'd be best to just briefly go through some of the high points we've had as a podcast, low points we've had as a podcast, both integrity-wise, emotionally. We're covering the spectrum here.
Oh, absolutely. And if nothing else on this show, we've always been honest, open, and pretty frank about a lot of things, savory and unsavory, in regards to motorsport, to us.
We have also been terribly immature about some stuff as I look through this. Jesus.
Yeah. Because ultimately, first and foremost, we're fans. And this, I've always said, if we're going to be fans of anything, we should punch up rather than punch down. We were young, immature, early 20s podcasters like anything else as well. And
now we're immature, early 30s podcasters.
Exactly. Very much so. I'm talking to you now as a 31-year-old, and I started this when I had just turned 22, which kind of says it all. Because not the first moment on our list is episode 1. We could not do it without episode 1. We called it Genesis. For those who don't know, I was a Formula One YouTuber in years past. I had a YouTube channel. You may now know it as Harrison 101. It is still up. It still exists if you really want to go back and watch it. My days of trying to scramble together F1 gameplay on a Hopodge HD PVR, those were all the rage back in the Call of Duty Modern Warfare era. Back when that was the most popular game in the world. I joined the wagon, and I'd always wanted to make gaming videos, and I just got lucky with Formula One stuff. But I was twinning that up with doing a degree in broadcast journalism. It wasn't even the first degree I'd taken up. I originally did business studies with finance. Yeah, me being a finance guy, no, not fun. For those who don't know, my biggest inspiration to get into the world of broadcasting and journalism was Charlie Brooker, the comedian and writer. You may know him now from the Black Mirror series on Netflix and formerly Channel 4, because he used to be on there back in the days as well in the UK. He had a show back then on BBC4 called Screen Wipe. It went into a lot of the in-depth history of television. It was reviewing TV shows, how TV worked, some of the behind-the-scenes things that people just don't know about the industry at large, and that's what got me into doing a broadcast journalism degree. I think the whole show is still up on YouTube if you want to go out of your way to watch it. I think people have ripped it and put it on the internet since then because it was such a good show. But my final year on that broadcast degree was to do a special project. It was either a 10,000-word dissertation, and I didn't really fancy doing that back then, or you had to do a special project. I chose to do this. It was a podcast, and between me and one of my fellow content creators back then, some guy called Ryan Eric King, more on that later, we started this podcast, the Motorsport 101 podcast, and episode 1 was all based around the 2014 Russian Grand Prix. Remember when we used to race in Sochi? Those were the days.
I remember those days. We were all sad because Jules Bianchi had a life-changing accident that would ultimately claim his life the round before, and we were all just thinking, if nothing else, this Russian Grand Prix stinks, but at least everybody got to the flag safely. That was my recollection of it. And now here we are 500 episodes later, and we don't race in Russia anymore. We still have the memories of what Jules Bianchi could have been. Nico Rosberg is now a YouTuber and Sky Sports pundit.
Somehow. Yeah, it's weird how these things don't go. That's the other thing I remember from this race. Nico Rosberg having the mother of all lockups into turn 1 on the opening lap, effectively ruining his race and giving Lewis Hamilton an easy win, and then going the entire rest of the race on a set of hard tyres, and even set the fastest lap of the race with 2 to go. There was 0 tyre wear the first time out in Sochi whatsoever. Lewis Hamilton won the race. I don't think anybody really cared. I think we were all just happy that we had a distraction from such a horrible event just 1 round earlier. And it was nice just to have some racing again, even if it wasn't the most entertaining thing in the world. But that was episode 1 for you. Fun fact, I used to record these on Skype with King. Yeah, remember Skype back in the day?
Me and the boys are getting on Skype to play Overwatch.
Oh, yeah, getting on Skype and using a cheap-as-hell MP3 Skype call recorder that I downloaded for free with a watermark in it. And that's... but it sounded okay enough to pass off as a podcast. Again, podcasting technology in general has come a long way in the last decade, thankfully. But that was the first. I mean, as we joked, there were... The initial run of this show was only going to be 10 episodes. There are 3 moments in the first 10 episodes that make this list, and that was the first one.
The second one comes to us from the world of NASCAR, and this is going to be a recurring theme that NASCAR typically tends to jump the queue whenever something scandalous happens. And there's nothing probably more scandalous than the revelation that Kurt Busch might have been a domestic abuser, unless in one of the rare instances where it actually was a little bit more complex than that. This moment was titled, "My Ex-Girlfriend is a Trained Assassin." This was the reveal that Kurt Busch's ex, Patricia Driscoll, who originally levied the charges, was actually a trained assassin and set up a lot of this up and later defrauded a bunch of people, and it was all really, really messy.
Yeah, looking back on it now, we probably should have treated this with a tinge more seriousness, given the accusations that were being levied. But we found the initial story so unbelievable that we thought this has to be stretching the truth somewhat. And it turns out our gut feeling was right. But it was a horrendously wild story like Kurt on the other end talking about how she would come home in the middle of the night covered in blood from special ops missions, and like I just, it was batshit covering. Like, it was so batshit that we had to get in, because back then M101 was a lot more of a just generic motorsport show. We bundled everything in together from the world of motorsport, and we put it in one episode at a time. It's a lot. I think part of the reason we're now at 500 is because we do one episode per major racing event now. Back in the old days, we would just bundle 2 or 3 together in one pod and just call it a day. But yeah, my God, this was a wild story. And yeah, it turns out Patricia Driscoll was a fraudster. The allegations were not true. And if, again, Google this up if you want to see the full details since then, because my God, it takes some turns. It would probably make for a much better podcast now than it did back in 2014, because this was before the days of people listening to true crime like it was a personality trait. But yeah, my God. Wild story on that one.
And then episode 10. The run's over. We've done it. The school project is finished.
Or so we thought.
We jump forward to episode 26, where we decide to reboot. You're no longer doing YouTube. You are all in on this school project.
Yeah, as Zoe says, "Oh, I feel attacked by that in the chat." Sorry, Zoe. Was one of our frequent guests on the show, and now one of our best friends. Zoe Hamilton talks about it, of course, in great detail. But yeah, this was the thing. Between episodes 10 and 26, we kept going because we genuinely did enjoy what we were doing, and the audience that we did have really enjoyed it. Oh, by the way, got the highest grade possible on that final project in the end. So, a big thanks to Sue Bowerman, who was my university lecturer at the time, who I'm still friends with now. Over a decade later, one of my biggest supporters. She was in tears when she found out I joined WTF1. God bless her heart. She's always a delightful woman who looked after me so well when I was at the University of West London, and she graded it an 80 out of 100, which was first class honours for the whole thing, and that alone got me a 2-1 for my whole degree. So, Sue, I owe you so much for that. But yeah, in between 10 and 26, I had just kind of gotten fed up with YouTube. Honestly, I'd seen the extreme growth that the Arabs and the TMF Marduks and the ex-Matty Gs of the world had gone through by being Formula One YouTubers. And I kind of got lost in the source of looking at the numbers too much, and it was starting to depress me. So at a certain point, I just decided I don't want to keep doing this anymore. And it was a walk I had with Adam Johnson, one of our ex-co-hosts of the show, who just said, "Dre, why don't you just do the podcast full time?" And it was like, yeah, let's do it. We, him, and King got together, drew up an action plan, drew up a Patreon list, put all the perks together, and rebranded and rebooted M101 as kind of what it is today. Like, this is kind of really the start of what you now know as Motorsport 101 in kind of our second act, so to speak. And it was that. And I also want to give a shout out to someone that doesn't get enough credit in those early days, Zara Daniela, who in the early days of the pod did incredible custom Photoshop and artwork for each of our episodes. If you really scroll back to like between episodes 25 and say maybe 70 or 80, she did custom artwork for all the thumbnails of our episodes. She did an incredible, she gave it far too much attention than it ever deserved. But it was incredible, like seriously incredible. So if you ever want to go back and look at some of those episodes and check out Zara's work, she did great stuff for that. She's now a writer for David Emmett at motomatters.com. And again, David Emmett does tremendous MotoGP work, the best in the biz in that regard. So I'm glad we both kind of fell up in a sense. So I wanted to give a shout out to Zara as well, because she's a phenomenal part of our show's history and doesn't get enough flowers, quite frankly.
So we move along. Of course, racing's a sad business, and we, of course, covered the crash that would take Jules Bianchi's life. Episode 43 was also one that was pretty sad. This was the passing of Luis Salam, the Moto2 rider who died in a practice crash during the Catalan Grand Prix in June 2016. We paid tribute to him and also talked a little about the racing once all that was done.
Gone far too soon. And again, there's a common theme we'll get to across these 500 episodes. Luis Salom was taken from us far, far too soon. He just did. I mean, I will always personally remember that epic freeway title fight he had in Moto 3. I want to say back in 2013. That was him and two guys that would go on to have exceptional MotoGP careers, Maverick Vinales and Alex Rins. He was the main antagonist in that freeway title fight that went all the way to the final corner of the final lap. In the end, Maverick would go on to win the title, but he was leading that championship for the majority of it. I think he was every bit as talented as Maverick and Alex, who are both now multiple time with multiple manufacturers race winners in MotoGP. That's a very rare club. In general, two of the best bike riders in the world right there, and Luis Salom was right there with him. Just so tragic, and Catalan has gone on to improve its safety since, but that short wall at turn 12 was ultimately the problem, and just a horrible accident. And the sport, I mean this. I don't mean this in necessarily a guilty pleasure sort of sense, but given the amount of tension that was in MotoGP at this point, obviously this was coming off the back of 2015 and that horrible Valentino Rossi, Jorge Lorenzo, Marc Marquez title feud and the kick, and some guy who wrote about it a lot in that time. The sport needed to come together for something that was bigger than it for the day. Because I remember that was the first time that Rossi and Marquez shook hands after the feud of 2015 that the sport had gone global over. So that was quite an iconic image where even if it was just for one day, those two big personalities, big characters were just like, this is bigger than the sport. And to a degree, I think MotoGP needed that. I wish it didn't come from such horrible circumstances, but the sport absolutely needed a day. It needed to heal. It needed something to get people back on the same page, because it was a nasty time to be a bike fan back then. It wasn't a good time. And it's a shame it came at Luis Salom's expense. But that was, I think, one of the first real catalysts of what I would say is the healing process of that.
I agree. Now, independently of all this, I got to know Adam Johnson on Reddit because he took a liking to some of the stuff that I was doing early on to cover Japanese motorsport, specifically Super GT and Super Formula, in a way that nobody was doing at the time because they just kind of, dropped the ball. And then it leads me to listen to episodes of the podcast, which leads me to talk to you. And then episode 52, which admittedly was under dire circumstances because we just lost multi-time sprint car champion and Indy 500 competitor Brian Clausen. This is also, the moment where I show up.
Yeah, you're here. And it's amazing how these things turn out. Yeah, like Adam was getting a little busier because he was doing a lot of stop motion videos, a lot of motorsport videos. He was trying to explore himself as a content creator, and he recommended a certain someone called RJ O'Connell. And you came along and you fit like a glove, RJ. You were exactly what we needed. You just a incredibly passionate motorsport fan like the rest of us, but also witty, funny, knew a whole bunch of obscure references, and wasn't afraid to talk some shit. And you fit us like a glove. And as Adam slowly would fade away in our show's history, because he had other projects to focus on, and including Twitch and streaming and all sorts, RJ kind of became our third wheel, our third permanent host for a little while. And this, one pillar of the foundation that built this place. And I was very lucky to meet RJ in person for the first time last year, and he is every bit as delightful in person as he is behind a podcast or a Discord call every 2 seconds. He's a delight, and we couldn't do this show without him now, and we're very, very lucky. I will always be grateful to Adam for giving us RJ, because we couldn't do this show without him, and I'm very, very proud to have him on the show. And he is now second on the all-time appearance list for this podcast. I think he's getting close to 300. I think you're getting close to 400 appearances now yourself.
It was just meant to be one guest appearance.
You know, it's well, you've now had more appearances on here than King, which is wild.
Not as wild as the moment to cap off episode 63. Now, Dre, you used to have an open mailbag for a lot of these shows, and you would solicit questions from like the general public.
Yeah, I did.
And
wonder where that went.
This was a shag, marry, kill question that I believe came from good friend, longtime friend of the program, Danny Brennan. 3 people were multi-time world champions, Max Verstappen and Ayrton Senna, pre-Verstappen's championships. Who was the other one in this?
I can't actually remember for the
life of me. Was it Crofty? Because I remember, I actually remember, and this was before I became a full-time co-host, and you had just read a question I had submitted that was basically along the lines of, which motorsport commentator would you like to have calling your bedroom activities?
Yeah,
I had no idea it was going to be structured in a way that this would be the question that would immediately follow that.
Yeah, it was a beautiful setup, and it was by complete accident the way it's set up like that as well. And yeah, I
don't believe it was by accident, now that I think about it.
Yeah, I must admit, this was like 8 years ago, but my memory is foggy of this incident. But yes, the booty call question had to feature in here. This is one for the real long-time listeners out here. That was the thing. And yes, it was between Verstappen, Senna, and David Croft is who I would have in a shag, marry, kill. And this was me back when I had zero filter and would answer just about anything on these podcasts. And I openly said, and I quote, I would shag Ayrton Senna for his passion. Now,
episode 68 and 69, we were actually blessed to have a great championship fight. And in one episode, Nico Rosberg finally won the big one after 11 years of trying and many years as Lewis Hamilton's teammate, some great battles. And then the following episode, he abruptly retires at the top of his game.
Yeah, absolutely. This was one of the biggest genuine shocks in F1 history for me in recent memory. I mean, the title win was not, I'd argue, not the real surprise here, because I think Nico Rosberg, I've always felt kind of sorry for Nico in the sense of, I wrote about this at the time on the website. I distinctively talked about how it felt like he was always in somebody else's shadow, whether it be his dad, when obviously his dad being a former world champion, and I think at one stage it was 82 that Keke won his world title, and then get into Williams kind of off the back of Hamilton, who had already been deemed the next big thing in F1 because he got in there with a much bigger team. He was at McLaren. Rosberg got there the year before, but with Williams when they were more of a midfield team. Then becomes the face of Mercedes originally. He outshone Michael Schumacher's return during the back end of the V8 era. And I thought, okay, Nico's becoming a top-tier player in F1, and then Lewis Hamilton shows up, his best friend of 15 years. And of course, this was the blockbuster recent move in F1 history. And Hamilton is just marginally better than Rosberg for the 3 years they're together. And little did we know going into 2016 just how much Nico Rosberg was sacrificing himself physically and mentally to try and beat Lewis. Again, I said this before, I long for the day Nico Rosberg writes a book because I hope he does, because I would love to hear him go into the detail as to how that 2016 title fight played out, because he put everything on the line. He was doing, like, some of the stories he talked about, like he was going on runs in Japan to try and lose like 800 grams in weight because he reckoned it was worth half a tenth, and then he goes and qualifies on pole by like 200ths of a second, and he reckons that was the reason he got that pole. You know, the barges, the giving it shit, the cap throw in 2015, the fact he won 7 straight between those 2 seasons. Rosberg gave everything. Maybe a little bit too much. And maybe that's why he retired at age 31.
Yeah. Looking back on it now, we now know that, like, Rosberg, if he'd won that championship, he was going to walk away, even though he just signed a new contract extension. And I think this feeds into, like, the present day, where we've not had a lot, where, with one very big outlier exception, we've not had a lot of, like, great championship battles, and we certainly haven't had, like, an intra-team battle that has had this much on the line than when Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg were together in Mercedes for the 4 seasons that they were together, for better and for worse. 2017 rolled around, Dre, and see, the funny thing is that you were not just on Motorsport 101. You had a side project going on, a side project to the side project, although maybe this was the main project?
I guess. I mean, yeah, like... And look, again, this is going to be the shout-out hour, so another shout-out to Mr. Jake Sanson, who is still trucking along as a fantastic commentator to this day. Back then, he had a project called Downforce Radio, and I openly admit it was Jake Sanson that gave me my first real big break in motorsport media. They wanted to put together a MotoGP podcast. And they were taking applications for presenters, and I thought, well, okay, it's free, it's not paid, but it's worth a crack. I think I know my stuff about bikes. And I gave it a crack. They put me together with some guy called Louis Sadabi. That was my first mistake. One of many. But we came together, and we clicked immediately. Like, we played off each other incredibly well as co-presenters, as pundits. We were very like-minded, but we also kind of knew what the other person was thinking, and it just clicked. And we did about 150 episodes of Bike Live together as a part of Downforce Radio. And then when Downforce kind of transitioned more towards being a 24-hour radio station as opposed to a podcast platform, we walked away together, and it was the 3 of us, because I want to give Rebecca James her shine as well, because she was a big part of our show's early history as well. She's since moved away from motorsport. She's now a full-time mum, looking after a couple of delightful little kids, and we still talk like 10 plus years later. So shout out to Rebecca James, love you, girl. But we brought Bike Live, as it was called back then on Downforce Radio, over to Motorsport 101, and again, like, I give Jake his full due. He had zero qualms or issues with us bringing the Bike Live name over, having us come over and continuing the show with his blessing. And we did another 92 episodes together as part of Motorsport 101's entire network, and it was a blast. We had many great, some great moments, so some sad moments, but overall, like, Lewis, I've named him because he was my radio husband, because we did so much together. And again, I'll talk more a bit about Lewis towards the end of what I like to call the Bike Live block, because I wanted to get some Bike Live moments on here, because it's only fair as a part of the network to give it its shine. But bringing Bike Live over was one of the coolest things we ever did, and very much enjoyed it. It was an absolute pleasure to be able to do that under our own banner as opposed to Downforce's.
I don't think it's as cool, though, as getting to honor to interview, while he was still with us, the 2006 MotoGP World Champion Nicky Hayden.
Oh, this one hurt, man. Looking back on it now, I've listened to it 15, 20 times, because Nicky Hayden wasn't just a fantastic bike rider. Nicky Hayden was everything great about Americana in motorsport. He was one of the last real bastions of the AMA series between him and Ben Spies, and just he was the shining beacon of American motorsport talent. And getting to interview, because this is towards the back end of his career when he was racing for Honda at World Superbikes at the time. He just won his first World Superbike race over there with them in Sepang as well. And amazingly, out of nowhere, we reached out to the Pana Honda team, and Lewis got his number. And the funny story is, I mentioned this a couple of times on the show before, and I mentioned it in my book, The Kick, as well, that we got the time zones wrong. We thought Texas somehow was on the Eastern time zone, so he was 5 hours behind us Brits. It was actually 6. We got that wrong, so we called Hayden an hour early, and he was still in bed at like 6 in the morning, having got the time wrong out by an hour. And we were like, "Oh, Nicky, we're so sorry. We got the time out wrong." And Nicky was like, "Nah, just do the thing now. I'm here. I'm now. It's cool." And he interviewed us from his bed in Kentucky. Probably still very tired, but he was incredibly charismatic and charming and kind, and everything you've ever heard about Nicky Hayden that's been said about him as a personality and a character is 101% true. It's my favorite interview I've ever done as a journalist and as a broadcaster. I love Nicky. He was a fantastic personality, a fantastic character, a wonderful bike racer, but an even better human being. And he is very, very sadly missed in the world of motorsport, and I miss him so much.
I can't agree with you more with any of that. Cam would agree. Cam's not here right now, but he will be back. But for now, it's just us two. Want to bring a little more levity towards later on in the Bike Live run. We had a race that was #canceled.
Yeah. This is the one that gets quoted up the most when people talk about our Bike Live history. The one that always brings up is the cancelled episode. This was a prominent one because this was a rough one, man. Holy hell.
2018 British Grand Prix doesn't happen because the new pavement, the new tarmac on the circuit is not fit for purpose.
You got to remember as well, there was a bucket load of rain going into this weekend. This was all, it was one, if memory serves, in the UK, this was the wettest August it had ever had in the UK. Global warming is a bitch. But the point I'm getting at here is that it was the wettest August I think the UK had ever had to that point. It bucketed it down pretty much all weekend long, which is rare in Britain. And you don't normally get 3 days of non-stop rain. And as you mentioned, Silverstone had just been resurfaced by a cowboy firm that didn't really know what they were doing when it came to resurfacing racing tracks. And the tarmac that they had put down was, as RJ said, not fit for purpose. It basically turned the water on the track into a skid pan. It was extremely dangerous, and it was marked on, I want to say it was Saturday morning. I think it might have been FP3 Saturday morning when Tito Rabat had a horrifying accident heading towards Copse on the Hangar Straight, where he couldn't get the bike stopped. His bike skidded, lost control at 190 miles an hour, shattered his leg from the impact of the incident. His career was never quite the same after that, and in essence, it was horrible, but in the same way, it was a miracle because the paramedics there saved his life. He almost bled to death right there and then because he had so much blood loss from the incident that he almost died from that alone. Very fortunate that I remember there was a great clip when they came back there in 2019 on TNT Sports where Rabat got to thank the paramedics that saved his life because they were the first responders to the scene. But the riders were concerned. They openly said to Dorna and the sport directors, this is not right. We've got a guy in a hospital bed right now. This is too dangerous. And the rain on that Sunday never stopped. And yeah, they couldn't bring anybody back on the Monday because marshals are not paid in the UK to do what they do. And as a direct result, race was cancelled. and we spent 2 hours talking about that on Bike Live. It was one of my favorite episodes. Again, I wish the subject matter was better. No one wants to really talk about a cancelled Grand Prix, but how we got there was fucking wild.
I think I could find something that you want to talk about less than a canceled Grand Prix, and that is the Mahias rule. This comes up all the time. You keep saying you will never have to explain what the Mahias rule is again, and then it keeps coming up.
I think it's only fair, given this is our 500th episode, I have to explain it one last time. Right?
Oh, we gotta explain the Mahias rule again. Okay.
Because this happened, I want to say it was a World Supersport race at Portimao back in the day, and it involved a guy that would go on to win that year's title, Lucas Mahias, former French rider, former stunt rider as well, that transitioned into full-blown racing, and turns out he was really good at it. And it was a rule where a race was red flagged. It was back in 2018. And my God, this was such a confusing thing. But there was a rule in World Superbikes. The race was red flagged, and because they had gone past 3/4 distance, it was not going to be restarted. The result, as it stood on the count back for a lap, was final. So Lucas Mahias has won this race. There was another rule in the book. The rule was you had to return your bike to pit lane within 5 minutes of the red flag being declared for the result to stand. The problem was, Mahias had just picked up a rear puncher after the red flag was already called. So now being told he's got to get back to the pits in 5 minutes, he had to ride around a Portimao track with a fully deflated and shredded rear tyre within 5 minutes to try and keep his win. He makes it back in time, barely, I think with about 30 seconds to spare. Just one problem. He cut the course trying to get back to the pits in time. World Superbikes noticed that, and then they disqualified him anyway. And this is the reason we had to keep explaining this was because it was a rule that was implemented in British Superbikes, which we were still covering at the time with people like Shaky Byrne, Leon Haslam, Jake Dixon, etc. And also it was brought in, or so we thought it was brought in, for the Suzuka 8 hours, because this came up again with Jonathan Ray over there as well in 2020. But
2019.
2019, actually, yeah, quite. I got the year wrong. But this came up in 2019 when Jonathan Ray thought they might have won the Suzuka 8 hours with a late red flag, and turns out there wasn't that rule in their book, so the win got to stand. It's a mess. But the Mahias rule has come up so many times in Motorsport 101 / Bike Live history, we had to put it in this 50 moments list because it has become a staple part of what I'd like to call motorsport shithousery. So, yeah, well, the Mahias rule had to feature in there, and we've named it as such for that very reason. Way to go, Lucas Mahias.
Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end because after 92 episodes, Lewis Sotheby got the opportunity of a lifetime. We weren't bitter that Lewis had to leave us because, he got a brand new job at Dorna. We're just happy for him, man. I mean, he gets to be a MotoGP World Feed commentator through the passage of time and work put in with Dorna. But, this is awesome.
It's the first of, I think, an incredible run we had of the group of guys we all became getting professional permanent gigs in the industry. And we did 92 episodes together of Bike Live. We'd even met in person a couple of times at Autosport International. I met an ex-girlfriend thanks to meeting Lewis through that very event. He's been a major part of my life on and off the track, Lewis. And like I said, we did over 200 shows together in total between Downforce and M101. And just out of nowhere, I just got a call from him saying, "Dre, can we talk?" And I'm like, "Of course." And he just explained that Dorna had offered him a gig as part of their social media team back then. And he was going to up sticks and move to Barcelona to do it. And which is an incredibly brave thing to do. I mean, we Brits are not known as, like, we'll go for a holiday, but we won't like live there unless you're in a really fancy English part of Spain, like a Benidorm or some shit. Lewis up sticks and moved to Barcelona, where Dorna headquarters is based, and he told me that, Dre, there's going to be some commentary gigs thrown in there as well, but I'm going to be on their social media team. And eventually, a year later, he'd become their world feed commentator alongside the great Matt Burt, who, you know, again, great guy. I got to meet him last year as well, and fantastic commentary team. And we were crying. We were in tears to each other on the phone when he finally told me about it, because, of course, I was devastated to lose Lewis as a partner and as a host, but just so immensely proud of him at the same time as well. That is the dream gig for so many people that are lucky to get into this space, and couldn't be prouder of him. Even to this day, he's still there now, still trucking. He does incredible work over there, and he partly came as a result of us, and that is something that I will always hang my hat on as lead host of this show. That, you know, we genuinely were able to make a difference and advance our careers through the medium of talking shit about bikes for a couple of hours a week. It was a sincere pleasure. That was the final episode of Bike Live we ever did. And if you guys didn't know, the thumbnail for that episode, if you go back and find it, was the time he surprised me by coming down all the way down to London and finding out which bookies I worked in at the time and taking a picture outside the shop, because that's the sort of person that Lewis is. He's a little shit, even though he's 6'4" and taller than me. But he's one of the sweetest, kindest men you will ever meet in your life, and
a damn fine color commentator on these MotoGP World broadcasts. Like, I can't imagine. Man. I can't imagine watching MotoGP broadcasts on any other media groups, like UK tailored specific feed.
Yeah, and we've been critical of BT Sports coverage at times before. I've made no bones about it. Lewis is a wonderful palate cleanser, and he does. I mean, we're not just saying that because he's our mate. He genuinely is a fantastic commentator. He will go down as part of Dorna's history as one of the best they've had alongside him on that world feed. And again, we're so proud of him, and I only hope he can continue to aspire to even greater heights, because I got to work with him for 6 years, and it was an absolute pleasure. Not one argument, not one falling out the whole way through. We just did bikes, and we loved it, and it was everything great about this show.
Definitely. I think with the recent news of Andretti Global's attempts to try and get into Formula One, it's only right that we talk about the end of Manor F1 team. The last time that we've had like a Formula One team just cease to exist with no continuity at all. Manor was the last team left standing from the 2010 expansion. Was meant to have 4 teams. What became Caterham, HRT, what became Manor, and the USF1 team, which didn't even get off the ground. But we lose HRT after 2012, we lose Caterham after 2014, and we lose Manor at the end of 2016.
It's incredibly sad in a sense, because, like, a lot of people, given the recent current chaos in F1, want to talk about how good the old days used to be. And I have to keep reminding people that the old days weren't straightforward either. This was the last time that the FIA wanted to have an expansion. This was back in 2010. And I think a lot of people forget that 2010 expansion almost caused a breakaway league, which, you know, people didn't like the idea of expansions of teams. Who'd have thought? Remember that, it becomes important later, etc. You know, the FIA was writing $10 million checks to get these teams on board. We went to 12 teams. You had 24 cars on the grid. And yeah, Manor was the last survivor in multiple forms. It was Manor, it was Mauritia.
Virgin.
It was Virgin at one point. Remember when Lucas Di Grassi was briefly a Formula One driver?
Yeah, remember when Richard Branson parlayed like an associate sponsor deal, a championship-winning Braun GP into a team that would really only last like 1.5 years under the Virgin name?
Yeah, it was a hot mess. these teams were brought in on the provision there was going to be a budget cap that was going to help sustain them on the grid, and that budget cap never came. Well, it did, but 10 years later. And they never. Looking back on it now, RJ, I think it's fair to say they never stood a chance, really, for various reasons. The sport didn't give them as long a rope as they needed to really stick around long term. HRT was gone first. Lotus went a few years longer, but we'll always have Finbar O'Connor in that.
No relation.
No relation. In Abu Dhabi, looking like a bat out of like a fish out of water, trying to figure out what the hell is he doing, sitting in a press conference with the team bosses, as the team was literally. It was asking. I remember Lotus was asking fans for money at that point to keep them afloat. That's how desperate they were, and then Manor trucked on for a couple of years longer, but by 2016 they were done, and the F1 grid's not been that rich and plentiful since.
Yeah, I remember like the last few years of Manor. This is when they bring in Jules Bianchi as a second option because Luis Razia, who was meant to be the team at Matt Chilton, couldn't pay the bills. So they ended up accidentally upgrading. We always have that incredible moment at Monaco where he scores points despite the penalty. The sadness when he has his crash, he passes away untimely. And amidst all of that, the team almost died at the end of 2014. It comes back as a skeleton crew with Will Stevens or Roberto Meri, eventually pulling Alexander Rossi by mid-2016 to thinking, right, you've got two Mercedes-affiliated youngsters and Pascal Wehrlein and Esteban Ocon drive with the team. Things are looking up, and then they miss out in the top 10 in the standings, which means no prize money, which means it's curtains for them. And I think it's only appropriate that we tie this into our next moment, a double moment. Bernie Ecclestone leaves, and Liberty Media takes over with Chase Carey as the figurehead, as Formula One is under new management. Now, things haven't gone smoothly for Liberty Media, I will say, but it's important to remember that things did not go smoothly under old management either.
Exactly. This was the very next two episodes. Like when Manor died, episode 72. 73 and 74 was Bernie is gone, and then Liberty Media's taken over. They bought the sport for just under $6 billion back at the end of 2016. And Chase Carey, with his epic mustache, becomes the new CEO of Formula One until the end of 2020. He was there for 4 years, and before Stefano Domenicali would take the top job, and he's been there ever since. But there's one thing that definitely sticks out about Chase Carey's tenure and time within F1, and that was the quote that always gets me when he first got there. We want Formula One to have 25 Super Bowls.
We're almost there. I don't know if I call them Super Bowls, but they definitely feel like they have a lot of Super Bowl exhaustive level media circus around them.
Yeah, like this was really the start of the embryonic phase of what we now look at as F1 in the last 8 years or so, where like Formula One was still incredibly antiquated under the Mosley Ecclestone era, however you want to describe it. Essentially, like, do you remember? Like, they only just started using race hashtags by 2016 and actually having a social media team. Like,
yeah, that's so weird that it was like this for the longest time. I mean, this is like the Premier League of international motorsport, but like they got on the ball with like the digital age, and Formula One was just like, we don't need it because we have our old established base and our old money, and we don't see any reason to change. Well, things did change. I mean, regardless of what people think about Drive to Survive nowadays, it has had a pretty big impact on the sport. Now people see it.
This sport was in the dark ages 10 years ago when it came to social media footprint. It's genuinely done a very good job of closing that gap and catching up since then. It's still got a lot of work to go still, absolutely. But I'm glad, if nothing else, Liberty realized, shit, we got to get our shit together in terms of public-facing content and, you know, bringing some personality and character into an otherwise very dull, very antiquated, outward-facing sport. So, yeah, we've come a long way in that sense. And unfortunately, we still have a long way to go.
Next on the list is Fernando Alonso's debut at the 2017 Indianapolis 500. This was something that was a little bit unprecedented, at least in modern memory, that a sitting full-time Formula One driver and a two-time champion would take time out of his Formula One schedule because his Formula One time was not going good at McLaren Honda to go run the Indianapolis 500. It was a big, big deal. And he largely performed up to par until his Honda engine let go. And that ended up being like one of the final straws that broke the camel's back in the relationship between McLaren and Honda, and would have so many ripple effects throughout the moment of motorsport. Like, just the moment itself of Fernando Alonso, he's here at the Indianapolis 500. It's a big deal.
It was a massive deal. It was one of my favorite stories to cover on M101, because that was a trilogy of Fernando Alonso 500 attempts in the end, but this was the first one. In fact, so much so, I even pulled out a prop if you're watching this on Riverside. The very first mini helmet he had from that first attempt back in 2016. I was a new IndyCar watcher and fan and covering the series at the time, but it was genuinely incredibly cool that, don't get me wrong, this is not a dig at IndyCar, I promise, but it just didn't have that clout that Fernando Alonso coming to attempt your race was ever going to have. This was global motorsports eyes, the eyes of the motorsport world, zooming in on the Indy 500 because Fernando Alonso was going to give it a go. And, you know, he was already looked at as one of the pound-for-pound best F1 drivers that's ever graced this earth, and he was giving it a good go, a genuine effort, and it was a great effort. You know, Marco Andretti loaned him his setup. It was a very good setup. Alonso was top 5 in qualifying. He led multiple laps. He was genuinely in with a shot at winning this first time round until his engine let go. And as, like you said, that was kind of the last straw, really, for Alonso and his relationship with Honda, because it all kind of just fell apart, and that was part of the reason why he felt like he kind of felt like it was just the end of a deteriorating cliff when he went back to McLaren. But it was such a shame that it ended the way that it did. But it was so cool at the time to see him down there, or bright papaya orange car, the 29 plate, and just overall, it was an incredible 2 weeks of watching it happen and seeing how it all came together, and the fact that, he was genuinely brilliant at it too. This was the peak of the series, unfortunately. And as JB in our chat rightly points out, if Alonso's Indy appearances are a trilogy, does that make 2019 the Empire Strikes Back of this saga?
We'll get to that in a bit. We also had another very interesting race not long after that, and that was Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton. The brake check heard around the world in one of the wildest daggone races Formula One had in quite some time.
Wowee. As chief of the Sebastian Vettel fan club back then, this was a dark day in our house. Vettel lost his head for maybe the one big moment where he genuinely lost his head behind the wheel of a car and snapped. He thought he was being brake checked down the back of the castle section down the hill in Baku by Hamilton. That was not the case. But Vettel felt like he'd been brake tested, and Vettel pulls up alongside him on the penultimate corner of the track and raises his arm and then turns into the side of Hamilton's car under a safety car saying, "What are you doing?" and lost his head, and Vettel got a 10-second stop-and-go penalty for it. It cost him what I think was likely going to be a win because Hamilton's seat came loose that same race, and Valtteri Bottas drove over debris. It was one of the most chaotic Baku races ever. It was the race that no one wanted to win. That was Vettel losing his head, and it was a massive story. Like, it was the two best drivers in the world at loggerheads, and two guys that were generally very friendly with each other. Amazingly, and this is going to shock you, the media made more of a deal out of this than we did, in startling news. But they'd already had a private conversation, and Vettel had apologized for what had happened, and they were already good mates again by the time they got to Austria around later. But this was like the hot button topic of the sport by this point. So it was. I'm glad that the two of them handled it in a very mature and disciplined manner, because that was more than could be said for the rest of us plebs.
No kidding. We just had a couple of really good races as well. Like Alonso blows his engine to 500, but it still gave us that great finish between Takuma Sato and Elio Castroneves, where Sato wins his first 500, and Baku was really fun as well once we got past all of that mess.
No kidding. Raw chaos.
We had a couple ones that I think tie in neatly into one another. Episode 116 was our All Women in Motorsport special, where we invited Zoe Hamilton for a guest appearance and Elizabeth Blackstock, now of Jalopnik, for a guest appearance to talk about what was then known as the concept for the SHE Championship. And I believe this is what would turn into the W Series.
Yeah, eventually. Yeah, that's how it was manifested. And yeah, I wasn't on this one for obvious reasons, because it was an all basically the majority of the conversation was done by women, and and eventually Remy Connors, who would become Remy, and a trans guest as well on the show. Fantastic representation. We're very lucky to have Remy on as many times as we did.
The one respectable Alexander Rossi fan, as I think you point out. I was like, it was so funny because like I just gotten to know them at like leading up to the Indy 500 that Alexander Rossi would win out of nowhere. It's all wild how this all came together. But like we have this special where we just like I think we're very skeptical of this championship at its outset, and then as time passes, the championship fans plays like, hang on a minute, they're kind of doing some good stuff, and by the end of it, it's just like, well, this ended up kind of being a mess when the W Series goes under, and a lot of women are out of work in motorsport.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a messy one, because this was always going to be a divisive topic. Unfortunately, a lot of men seem to think they have the right ideas as to how to get women into motorsport, even though we are not the people that you should be listening to as to how that should happen first and foremost. Maybe we should, as a global entity, actually listen to the people this affects. Just throwing that one out there. And so we did. We got great representation. It was the Grid Girls podcast, as it was at the time, as Zoe quite rightly reminds us in the chat, and just asking them, well, how do you think this should happen? And it was a genuinely powerful and great conversation. And yeah, unfortunately, a lot of our skepticism about what would eventually become the W Series turned out to be true. It was a messy inception. I remember Sophia Floresh was getting into beef with people like Jamie Chadwick on Twitter, saying that this series was a bad idea and you should just race against men. And it was messy. It was full of pitfalls, and it led to some difficult conversations about the state of motorsport and how inherently sexist and misogynistic it can be. But I'm glad we were able to have that conversation between people who matter in this space, and I wish we did that more often in our time here.
Yeah. We also saw the end of Grid Girls in Formula One, which was always a hot button debate because, again, a lot of dudes think they know what's best about women in motorsport, and sometimes that just means like reducing them to eye candy for sponsors of the series, like not even as cheerleaders of a specific team like you have with Race Queens in Japan. They're just there to be eye candy, and that practice is largely gone. I don't really miss it. It's just kind of like I don't even really think about it now.
Yeah, it's what were we all clutching our pearls about here back then? I like, it was so weird. I remember I did a video on the Motorsport 101 YouTube channel talking about this very topic, and joking about using darts as a comparison because I'm a big darts fan, so you are.
So am I.
And we love darts, and this topic came up because this happened right around the time that darts had also gotten rid of their walk-on girls. They still have the dancers now in darts in the background when darts players have their entrances, but they've gotten rid of the of the woman that would often walk to the stage arm in arm with the male players. And I remember Michael Van Gerwen was the person that led the charge saying, we don't need them. And it was Raymond Van Barneveld who was the one who was saying, nah, they should bring it back. It's part of the show, innit? And I was like, wow, MVG is based. I like this dude. And yeah, I used that as an example because I said, well, darts kind of had an image problem for a long time in regards to that. They often had the reputation of just being overweight and addicted to alcohol. So the sport had come a long way in trying to clean that image up in the same way that Formula One had this baked-in tradition that women were treated as a prize to be won rather than being necessarily on the grid or a vital part of its representation. We could have always done better, and I'm glad that Formula One took that step. And backlash mostly from men who just wanted to look at them as sex objects. I'm glad at least a smidge of that culture was eradicated as a result of that, because this was a mess.
I guess they would call other people snowflakes. We'll call them the snowflakes. We'll get so worked up about some other cultural hot point that they can all get worked up about. Time goes on. They find some other thing to get distracted with. We go on through the year 2018, and there's one driver in particular who really catches our eye from the world of IndyCar, Robert Wickens, somebody who paid his dues in the ladder to Formula One, almost gets there, never does, pays his dues in the Deutsche Tourenwagen Master Series, one of the fastest tin top championships around. And in 2018, he comes over to IndyCar with what is now the Arrow McLaren team, which used to be Schmidt-Peterson Motorsport. And from his first race in St. Petersburg, where he gives Alexander Rossi almost everything he can to try and win on debut, this dude is box office. This dude is electric. And through what was a pretty tough season for the team, with James Hinchcliffe missing the 500 entirely, Wickens was the shining star. And then when we go to Pocono, he gets caught up in a multi-car wreck. He gets airborne, crashes into the catch fence. He has never regained full mobility since. That was a very tough day for us. But I think if there is a silver lining, is that this did not stop Robert Wickens from getting back in a race car and doing what he does best.
And it christened one of our most iconic phrases on the show in our time history. There's only one Bobby Wickens, because we loved him on this show. We still do love him on this show. And RJ summed it up brilliantly. He was electric. One of the most exciting rookies that IndyCar has had in recent years. From race one, he was competitive. He was fast. And this was the driver that was going to bring Schmidt-Peterson back up into play again. Not in the days of Simon Pagenaud when he was there before moving on to Team Penske. Did we see a driver that was of that caliber come over to Schmidt-Peterson Motorsport at the time? And yeah, this also kind of just marked the sad era of SPM as we knew it, because their season just kind of fell apart. Obviously, Wickens was brilliant in the first 2/3 of the year before that horrible Pocono wreck, and then James Hinchcliffe got bumped from the 500. They brought in Lena Gade, who did tremendous work with Audi in sports car racing as an engineer, but just couldn't adapt to ovals. Hinchcliffe got bumped. Wickens was looking like he was going to be a top 5 in the championship sort of runner immediately. And I'm like, okay, you've got an elite driver up on debut. Brilliant, fantastic. And then that horrible Pocono wreck happens. And yeah, it completely derailed the career of a guy that I think could have been in contention for a series title and possible 500s as well, which is such a shame. But as you quite rightly alluded to, RJ, his career is not over. He is still racing, and he's still incredibly fast.
That's right. He currently competes in the Michelin Pilot Challenge. That's IMSA's second-tier championship behind the prestige WeatherTech Sports Car Championship. He drives a TCR touring car for Brian Herta Autosport. And last year, in a very closely contested championship, he won the TCR class title, his first title since he won the Formula Renault 3.5 Series title back in 2011, when he was still the reserve driver at Marussia Version Racing. Funny how this all works out.
Yeah, we're incredibly proud of Bobby Wickens. He's a remarkable human story of determination, resilience, and just getting back and doing the damn thing, even after your life changes forever. He's since become a dad. He's gotten married since then, and his career has only gone from strength to strength. And yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful story as to how we got here. And, well, not wonderful in a sense, but the comeback certainly has been. And yeah, it's a remarkable story. And yeah, couldn't be prouder of him. Awesome.
Definitely. Now, time passes. We get to 2019. And as you mentioned, Fernando Alonso makes a second run, only now things are different. McLaren and Honda's relationship completely fractured, so McLaren's got a partner with Chevrolet for the second time around. Things are looking bleak, but it all looks like Fernando Alonso is just going to escape a last row shootout to make the field. And then in steps a past IndyNets champion for a team that was on the verge of going into administration with one of the greatest Indy 500 qualifying runs ever in the context of things. And this also becomes pertinent because now we're having discussions about whether or not Indy 500 spots are going to be guaranteed to the biggest teams.
And this is why I will always champion the phrase of the fastest 33 make the show. Because if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have days like this one. Because like Juncos at the time were a small town team led by Ricciardo. They had to they lost their main car early on in the fortnight of preparation. They had to use their backup chassis. They had to convert it into a super speedway car because it was normally built for road and street tracks. They had to convert it over. And Kyle Kaiser, who was, barely a full-time runner in the series, had to come in with his last chance attempt, get into the show with Fernando Alonso on the bubble. And by the slimmest of margins, Kaiser makes the show, bumps out Fernando Alonso in one of the genuine motorsport shocks of the decade, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Alonso goes home early. I still remember the scene of Alonso in the golf cart ready to leave the track because I think deep down, he knew what was about to happen.
Yeah, and we talked about this, I believe, on like the next episode after that, or maybe it was this episode, where one of the things that gets talked about is the report from Jenna Fryer's interview with McLaren CEO Zach Brown recounting all the ways that this went terribly. We read it to you line by line, and you just slowly went insane thinking of all the ways that it went wrong, from McLaren willingly missing testing times because their car is not painted the right way, to the famous line of Zach Brown doesn't go digging for steering wheels, to missing the conversions from standard to metrics. Oh, and then one thing that would emerge later, that they paid 7 figures for the privilege of a setup that would miss the show anyway.
Still, when people ask me what are my favorite M101 moments, this is in my top 5 comfortably. This was I promised to Krista Hardy, who was our guest on that episode, who does great work with Front Stretch over covering IndyCar in general. I promised I would not read the story of just how bad things have gotten and saved it for the podcast specifically. And then the guys on episode 193 read it out to me. It's exactly what had happened. And I was aghast. I lost my head thinking, how badly did you get this wrong? Even more, it goes to show you maybe the first time just how much Andretti's experience was actually helpful towards their initial attempt, because McLaren was flying solo this time. They didn't have Honda's backing, they had Chevrolet, and again, it was a complete unmitigated disaster from top to bottom. It was incompetent. They didn't have the right equipment. They were worried about their car being the wrong shade of orange. The metric to imperial conversions were all wrong. The setup was terrible. They paid 7 figures for the privilege. The longer it goes on, you just go, how on earth did they possibly get this so wrong? It was incredible in every sense.
it really goes to show that they underestimated the task at hand. And ultimately, it does lead to a lot of things. I think that was the moment where we realized that maybe this isn't going to be Fernando Alonso's second career. But it also led to McLaren investing into what was Schmidt-Peterson Motorsport and laying the groundwork for what we think, will be another powerhouse of the IndyCar series for many, many years to come. So,
indeed,
not all as bad. And another guy that got bumped for the show might be a linchpin of that organization. Some young guy named Patricio.
What happened to him?
And we did lose one of the legends not long after this. Dre, talk to us about Niki Lauda. I mean, his reputation in the world of motorsports speaks for itself.
Probably one of the hardest bastards in Formula One history, and I promise you that's a compliment. Niki Lauda was an incredible racing driver, but an incredible character as well. Like one of the most steadfast, loyal, but also determined individuals you would ever see. And this is already motorsport where you'd expect that from people. But Lauda did it with levels that were unprecedented at the time. Like, walking into a bank and asking for a £2 million loan to go fund his racing career, getting his hands dirty with setups and trying to figure out every little microscopic way of going faster and being completely unafraid of telling people with the biggest egos in motorsport, no, we should do things my way. And then backing that up on the track with 20-plus career wins, 3 world championships, and, of course, coming back from one of the most horrible incidents in motorsport history at the Nürburgring. And he was read the last rites on the hospital bed the day that happened. They thought he was dead for all money. Not only did he survive, but he was back in a racing car again 2 months later. It's still one of those stories where you look back in horror now thinking, they let this motherfucker do this? And realizing, no, he really just was that good. And he really was that determined to get back in a race car. But also, it kind of molded him into the more empathetic, understanding human being that he would become down the road. Look, we don't normally plug shit on this show, but I'll make an exception. Rush is an incredible movie. If you have not seen it, you probably have.
Listen, man, I know that Rush, not everything is factually accurate. It is a docudrama, not a documentary, but my goodness, they hit all the high points, and this is one of the best movies you could probably show to somebody who doesn't know anything about motorsport and anything about why Niki Lauda was just that cool. And that movie doesn't even cover, the fact that not only did he come back, but he won another championship. He walked away from the sport, then came back and won another. And then, of course, in the later years of his life, he's an advisor to Jaguar. That doesn't go well. So he becomes an advisor to Mercedes. Now remember, it was then David Hobbs, then of Speed Channel and NBC, who thought, well, Mercedes is bringing in Niki Lauda as an advisor. I remember how this went at Jaguar. This isn't going to go great at all. But, how it went so right. It wasn't always smooth, but Niki Lauda as an advisor to Mercedes presided over one of the great dynasties in the sport. It was probably, I would say he was the man responsible for bringing in Lewis Hamilton to begin with.
I'd say so, because Lewis credited him to that, saying, look, now Lauda pulled him to one side and said, look, I think you've got a bit stagnant at McLaren. Which is amazing to say about a guy that at the time had 20 career wins and a world championship of his own already, and said, look, we think we've got something special here for 2014 with this new power unit, these hybrids. We think we've got something special here. I remember him saying, if you come over here, we'll guarantee you championships. And he convinced Hamilton to make a switch that at the time I thought was crazy. Yeah. I know I'm not the only one who thought this, and I've said it all over social media over the years. I was one of the people. I was one of those haters. I thought this was a crazy move. I thought Mercedes was fast, but I didn't think they would ever win a championship. How very wrong were we? My goodness, the greatest dynasty, arguably in F1 history, was partially facilitated by Niki Lauda being able to talk the best racing driver in the world back then, at that point, quite possibly, into taking the biggest leap of faith of his career. And my goodness, did it ever work out.
I got to walk through the Mercedes garage in one of my F1 trips recently, and I still love that they have Lauda's red hat hanging up in the garage as if he's always there with the team. Now, back in 2019, we had another watershed moment in the construction of this podcast, because the year before I had brought in, who is now my soon-to-be editor-in-chief at Daily Sports Car, Stephen Kilby, to help preview the 24 Hours of Le Mans with us. But Stephen wasn't available that time, so we probably needed somebody to help us talk about what was another... It was a strange time, because we were crashing off the LMP1 bobble. The Convergence era is like years away, so we're thinking, who in the world is going to be out there to help us talk about the 24 Hours of Le Mans?
Enter Cameron Buckley. The guy who was living on our Discord's couch because he was a fan of us and he was into the early days of our Discord server, and we all knew he was incredibly knowledgeable about sports cars, about the World Endurance Championship, and we just had a brainwave one day to say, Cam, why not give it a go? And Cam agreed. He came on, and we liked him so much we kept him. He still owes me all that rent for the couch he sat on, but it's besides that, he's been pretty good.
Yeah, dude, it's crazy. Like sometimes, and when times have been tough, we've had to pull in guests from our community, and sometimes they work out great, but they don't come back to us. Sometimes they don't work out so great, and they don't come back to us. This one worked out great, and he came back to us. And as you mentioned, I don't know. Should we forgive some of the rent? Is this like a thing? Should we have like rent debt forgiveness?
Well, it wouldn't be the first time America's had some debt forgiveness out there. I think it's...
I think it would be the first.
Yeah, on second thought, that's probably for the best that we do that. We will forgive Cam's debt because he's been a wonderful asset to this show. He's one of the most knowledgeable all-round motorsport fans you could ever wish to have in your life, but he's also a huge nerd, a huge gamer, a huge sneakerhead. He still believes he's secretly Doom Guy, God bless him, but he is also an incredibly knowledgeable, passionate, all-round encyclopedia of knowledge. Not only like sports cars isn't even his number one thing, he's a bike guy first and foremost.
Yeah, this is the thing, Cam is like, we couldn't keep Louis Sotheby around, so this is like the closest thing we could have. And as we weave bike content into M101 after Bike Live ran its course, like, this is perfect.
Yeah, Cam has been the Swiss Army knife of pundits on this show, one of the most versatile motorsport fans we could ever wish to have. He's been an incredible co-host, a giant ball of anger for what it's worth. So a man after my own heart, clearly. Some of his rants and proclamations have been legendary in this show's history. And again, just a guy that got what we were about from day one and fit us like a glove, and was, the same passion, be unafraid to call out bullshit, but also just an incredible breadth of knowledge and able to weave that into just cracking jokes and just talking about the state of the motorsport. And we can barely do this show without him now. And God bless him.
We can still barely do the show. He's not here with us right now.
We're trying. We're getting there, but God bless Cam, man. Sadly, he couldn't make it here this week. He's busy closing an Apple shop somewhere in New Hampshire. But again, a cheers to Cameron Buckley, our third wheel, and our man, literally, as he calls himself, too angry to die.
Germany 2019, the 2019 German Grand Prix. One of the last Grand Prix we've had in Germany as of time of recording, probably the last at the Hockenheimring.
It was
an eventful race characterized by the drag strip, poor judgment. Because remember, the Hockenheimring has a drag strip that shares like the real estate between the final two corners, and it was a wet race, and if you slid off into that, it was curtains. And this drag strip was Heartbreak Hotel for so many logical contenders, from Charles Leclerc to Nico Hulkenberg. Nobody was spared. This doesn't even begin to describe how wild this was.
This was one of the wackiest recent races in the history of the series. My God. Lewis Hamilton being caught out by, again, we did not know that I personally didn't know there was a drag strip between those final two corners now at Hockenheim, because they host drag racing events now at the circuit. And if you know anything about drag strips, very abrasive, like very low grip, very easy to slide on that. And then, of course, once you throw in heavy rain, which it happens quite a lot in Germany, if you there races there over the years, disaster can happen. Charles Leclerc was in contention. He went on the drag strip. Nico Hulkenberg was, I think, running fourth that day and had a genuine shot at his first career podium. And he ended up parking it into the wall. And then Lewis Hamilton lost the front wing going off into that drag strip wall. And
this was also the race where, they have the stay out, in moment.
Yeah, that was another big one as well. And I also want to say, I think Netflix might have been filming them as well.
Because not only was Netflix filming them for Drive to Survive, which leads to the genesis of a Drive to Survive curse, but this was also the weekend where Mercedes was celebrating its 150th anniversary.
I think it was 125.
125th anniversary. So they got it all. Special overalls, special livery. It could not have gone worse for them. The dynasty of Formula One only comes away with a measly 2 points after qualifying first and third for the event. Oh, and Max Verstappen won.
Max Verstappen won. Remember, that becomes very important later. And I think that was also because of the way the results shook out. That was Robert Kubica's final point in Formula One as well from the family films.
Yeah. That was because of time penalties that would be implemented later. Robert Kubica, who had a life-altering, career-altering rally car accident 8 years prior and worked all this way to get back into Formula One. In the grand scheme of things, it was not a good year. And the way the race played out, George Russell should have been the man to score Williams' first and probably only points of the season. But I'm happy that Robert Kubica got that moment as his F1 time slowly petered out. He's now doing good things in the World Endurance Championship. I'm happy that he got that moment. Also, Sebastian Vettel came back from 20th to finish second. I forgot that this even happened.
Yeah, it was the other underrated story of that Grand Prix. Vettel, who at this point had started to fall out of favour at Ferrari for Charles Leclerc. They were clearly going down the road of making Leclerc their guy. Vettel was kind of being left out in the cold after what happened at that Grand Prix the previous year in 2018, where he put it in the wall and made his own mistake. Vettel was arguably never quite the same guy again after that crash. I think he rattled a degree of his confidence and he never really got back. But a year later, he would come back to that track and navigate the storm and drive from the back of the field all the way to finish second in the end. It was a remarkable comeback. I remember the home crowd were going ballistic over Vettel's comeback towards the end of that Grand Prix. I was losing my collective shit watching that race. It is a 10 out of 10 all-time classic Formula One race. I recommend to any fan to watch once because it is carnage.
It was really, really good. I remember where I was the day we lost Antoine Hubert in the 2019 Formula 2 feature race at Spa-Francorchamps. I remember I'd just gotten up and I'd heard there was a bad wreck and I was thinking, oh, geez. And then I heard the worst had happened and my heart just sank. And we got somewhat fortunate in respects because we almost lost two incredible drivers. We almost lost Juan Manuel Correa as well, who ended up suffering injuries that would derail like a lot of his career. It's kind of a miracle that he's still in Formula 2, continuing his racing career. But like, man, Antoine Hubert was really just getting things going in Formula 2. I mean, he comes in highly touted off of winning what was then the GP3 Series title. We now know it as FIA Formula 3. And he comes in his rookie year and has some fantastic moments early on in his rookie F2 campaign. Like the Monaco photo finish that he had, and then following that up with winning at his home race in Paul Ricard was really, really special. And in a time where the Renault team, which we now know as Alpine, was like starting to think about its future plans, Hubert was one of the less appreciated Alpine Academy members at that time who, at the time of his passing, it looked like it was all starting to turn around for him. Like suddenly everything was starting to click. And then it sucks, man.
That was a dark day. That was a very, very dark day. I was watching that F2 race and I saw the accident as it happened, and the images never left my mind.
I can't go back and watch it.
I don't blame you.
If it comes up, I look away. Like,
I don't blame you. It's never left my mind in the half decade plus since. It breaks my heart, and it's sad that it took something like that to start the conversation about what to do with that corner and the inherent safety risk that came with that corner and sending a bunch of cars up it at 180 miles an hour. And again, I wish motorsport was more proactive rather than reactive to safety conversations and in regards to it, because Anfon could have been saved on another day in an alternate universe, certainly, but just what a tragedy. I have every confidence that Anfon would have made it one day. I really do. And just a very promising life cut short. And if there's one person on the F1 grid who kind of lives on in his memory, it's Pierre Gasly, who was his best friend. It was his best. They were childhood friends. They came up through karting and racing together. And if you've never gone out of your way to read it, I do highly recommend his piece in the Players Tribune, talking about Antoine's life and how it related to Pierre's career and some of the difficulty he had in his time at Red Bull Racing, a job that he would go on to suddenly lose halfway through his first season there.
Yeah, that was not long after the drag strip of poor judgment, because Pierre has a late crash. I remember like everybody was saying like this is as bad as it could get for a Red Bull's second driver. Point is, they've not really had an adequate replacement since Daniel Ricciardo left them to go to Renault, Alpine.
And every year since then, Pierre goes back to that very spot and lays a bouquet of flowers at that patch, to honor his late friend. And it's very sad in that it's incredibly sad. And again, we were very lucky in a sense as well that we didn't lose Juan Manuel Correa that day as well, because it was just a horrifying wreck that forever changed Spa as a circuit, forever changed how we looked at Formula 2. The Rookie of the Year award in real world F2 to this day is still named in his honor. And just a very promising and talented life cut short, and just, again, horribly, horribly sad.
I agree. I think it's great that us and Formula 2 had the right idea by naming their Rookie of the Year awards after Antoine Hubert. That's going to continue for a while. Let's bring us a little bit of levity. Now, the International Fantasy Draft, remind me, is this is the second one we did where we had just like a couple of weeks where everything was racing all at once. We put together a draft of who was going to be the strongest performers, and we had like a prize pool. Was this the one that I'm thinking of?
I believe this is the original one.
Oh yeah, this is the original. And I think I remember like I had a hand in thinking of this, because my original idea was just like, if you could draft like any prospects on the ladder to Formula One, who would you draft? And then it turned into, if you could draft any racing drivers out there in the world, who would you draft?
Yeah, me, you, King, Chris Cook from Cook Productions 1 back in the day on YouTube, and Matt Carnero, formerly of Mystery Science Theater F1 back in the day. We all came together to do an international motorsport fantasy draft of who could you draft in the world of racing and motorsport and put the best team of racing talent and drivers available. It was an incredibly fun show. It was an incredibly fun special. We loved putting it together. I was fortunate enough to get the number one pick on that one, and I genuinely, to this day, still think I had the best team available that day. I was really happy with my team, and then we lost on, I lost on the viewers' tiebreaker because I distinctively remember Chris admitted he voted for Matt's team on purpose to make sure that I didn't win. I'm not bitter about it.
Balderdash. I thought this was going to be the one where you blew through so much of your budget cap like crazy. Nobuharu Matsushita, that was the Centennial Cup, and that was the one where you blew a lot of money on then Formula 2 prospect Nobuharu Matsushita, who just got renewed for his Super Formula deal at the last minute, day of recording. And then I think I just went off and won the whole draft. I don't know how the Centennial Cup laid out. We should do another fantasy draft, man.
We should do it at a certain point and go from there. We should definitely do that in the next 100 episodes or something along those lines, because it was a lot of fun to put together. I try not to talk about the Centennial Cup because I was so bad at it and somehow didn't end up last. It was a walking miracle. I ended up blowing 2/3 of my budget on Nobuhiro Matsushita, and that ended up being a complete unmitigated disaster. And yeah, not ideal.
Now, lest people think that we are a Max Verstappen appreciation station, Max Verstappen has not gotten his own special. Lewis Hamilton has. Episode 221, and this was back in a time when I was still kind of editing the show. That was one of the more fun ones I've ever put together.
Yeah, this was a very fun episode, and just talking about the legacy of Lewis and just what an impact he had become for Formula One, and people still debate about his cultural significance now in the era of Max Verstappen. A lot of Dutch folks like to get in my mentions about this, which is I think quite funny. But we're talking about quite possibly the greatest racing driver that's ever walked this earth. But beyond that, we're also talking about someone that has contributed immeasurably to the world on and off the track. He had become a brilliant ambassador for the sport. He'd become the biggest pusher for social change that it had, which we'll get to later, quite shortly actually on our list of moments, but also just an incredible friggin' racing driver at his core. And yeah, much deserved that we dedicated a special towards Lewis Hamilton, because my God, where do you even start with this man? A working class kid from Stevenage who, his dad had to work 3 jobs to fund his karting career and to keep him going when times got hard, and climbed the ladder, convinced people he was going to be the next big thing from the time he was on Blue Peter at the age of 9, and eventually making it to Formula One, which was a miracle. And then being good enough to be world champion as the first black full-time driver that Formula One has ever had. It's a remarkable story. They'll probably make a movie of this one day.
I don't think he met the hype. I think he exceeded it.
Which is crazy. It's you know what it is? Lewis Hamilton is our LeBron James.
Yeah.
In the sense of, he was a small-town kid from Akron, Ohio, in the same way that Hamilton was a small-town kid from Stevenage. And he had all the hype in the world coming into Formula One. You didn't watch the coverage back in the day, RJ, like we had on ITV when it was on free-to-air in 2006. That was the first time GP2 was mentioned during ITV F1 broadcasts. And they were talking about following Hamilton's result because they really did genuinely think Hamilton was going to be the next big thing. Before he'd even turned a wheel in F1, he was debuting with the best team in the business at the time, McLaren, 2007, alongside Fernando Alonso as a teammate who had just won 2 world titles at Renault. He had all the hype in the world, and then he was somehow better. It's incredible. In the same way, we're recording this the same week LeBron just hit his 40,000th NBA point.
Which is something that has been done by one human ever, and that is LeBron James.
Yeah, it's a remarkable coincidence in that sense, but I do really genuinely think that Lewis Hamilton is Formula One's LeBron James, and we've never had anything quite like him in Formula One, and I'm not sure we ever will again, quite frankly. he's one of one in the world of motorsport, and we are very fortunate to have him.
I think another thing that I think we'll never see again is the standing and scandalized president, CEO of one of the world's largest automakers, sneaking himself out of the country to avoid extradition in a musical case. Carlos Ghosn, Do Crimes. Metal Ghosn, Solid. Episode 228, one of the wildest stories in automotive culture in general.
The story of Carlos Ghosn, and at one point hiding in suitcases and luggage to avoid being detained and captured.
He hid himself in a Yamaha music case.
My God. Just an unbelievable... It was... Look, we don't normally have, like, big automotive stories break through on Motorsport 101 very often, but when it's that crazy, sometimes we have to talk about it, and this is one of those ones where you just kind of had to talk about it. It was absolutely ridiculous how this had all played out, and the man who was on house arrest and basically fled Japan in 2019 to do so, and next thing you know, he's hiding in a Yamaha music case while trying to be detained by the law. It's an unbelievable story, RJ.
It really is. I mean, it's not the first time like we've had something wild like this happen from like outside of motorsport. Do you remember when Quibi, the failed streaming service from one of the people that was co-founded by DreamWorks, like died during the middle of one of our recordings? That was wild. I still remember Cam Buckley's words to say, "Quibi's dead."
Quibi's dead. Yeah, that was just. It's one of those. Like Carlos Ghosn represents like the times where the real world crossed over very much into what we were doing on our pokey little motorsport show, and those moments stick in our heads as we record these episodes because Quibi dying was one. Carlos Ghosn, Do Crimes was another one that stuck in our heads for the way through. And I actually remember me mispronouncing his surname for the vast majority of that episode as I was recording it.
I mean, to be fair, it's not a conventional surname. To be fair, dude, it's crazy. It's hard to think though. Like Carlos was just like he was the man tasked with he was the man given all the credit for leading Nissan to a turnaround, a golden age, if you will, and now it just kind of like is there, defiant in spite of all of this. I don't know. It's very weird. 2020 was weird. We were going to have an Australian Grand Prix in 2020, and then we didn't.
We didn't. It was the pandemic. And the pandemic really landed. Really, that was a wild couple of weeks. I think the week before was when people started taking that pandemic so much more seriously when Tom Hanks tested positive for COVID while he was in Australia on a holiday with his wife.
NBA games were shut down because then Utah Jazz forward Rudy Gobert touched the microphones, then he tested positive, and then every game was suddenly getting canceled left and right. Yeah. I think when sports stopped was when we realized, like, hang on a minute, this is not just like, something far away in a place that we don't have to care about because we're in the Western world. No, this is at our front door. And especially at its outset, like the coronavirus pandemic was very, very scary because we didn't have a way to mitigate this.
No, it was just one of those things. And then it came to our little pokey world in F1 where that Australian Grand Prix, it was weird following that case on social media. We thought, okay, this Grand Prix still going to go ahead, but without fans. But the communication about that wasn't clear. Fans were still rolling up to the venue as if nothing had happened in the lead up to that race weekend starting in practice. And then someone in McLaren's camp tested positive for COVID. Then McLaren did the right thing, withdrew from the weekend on public safety grounds. And they were like, we don't feel comfortable competing knowing that we could be all positive. We could potentially, pass this on to somebody else. They did the right thing. They stopped competing that weekend. And then by the time Friday rolls up, the government of Victoria is like, no, this is not happening right now. And next thing you know, people like I remember that same morning, Sebastian Vettel and Kimi Räikkönen had gone back to the airport. They were like, "Fuck this, we're going home." And at that point, Ferrari's hand was forced, and via a great big conversation groupthink, Formula One was over for 3 months.
Dude, it was so crazy. Everything was over for like several months. Like all of motorsport went virtual because sponsors had obligations. The only way they could do it was through sim racing with guys who were passionate about it and guys who weren't, but were just fulfilling sponsorship obligations. It was a very, very weird time. And then on top of it all off, when we do come back, when we start to come back to racing, we're in the like shadow of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we're in the shadow of one of the largest uprisings for racial justice, racial equity that I'd seen in modern society in quite some time. And we have effectively 2 podcasts about it. A Blackout Tuesday Q&A when a lot of people on social media blacked out for racial justice. And then we had a postscript at the very end of our episode where we came back. And now that we're like 4 years away removed from not just the apex of the pandemic, but also the apex of the Black Lives Matter movement, it's a lot to take in.
It was a strange time. The murder of George Floyd changed a lot of the dynamics socially of how we talked about racial injustice in general. If there is one positive I can take away from that horrible murder, it's that it did break down a lot of barriers as to how people talked about racism, systemic racism, and racial injustice in the world. And it seemed to be for a lot of people, it was the enough is enough moment. And a lot of people started using their platforms trying to promote social change in a positive way. And yeah, looking back on it now, it was a big cultural awakening for a lot of people, Lewis Hamilton included. Hamilton he'd gone into the world of being vegan, and he talked about the global warming. We didn't take him all that seriously when he was talking about that until he was angry about George Floyd's murder and was like, you know what? I'm Lewis Hamilton. I'm going to start using my platform to talk about this. Why hasn't anybody else in F1 stepped up and talked about it? And he, in combination, and I will give them their credit because as heads of the GPDA, Sebastian Vettel and Romain Grosjean, although Grosjean he himself fumbled this a little bit himself, started pushing the drivers to try and make an impact in using F1 when they came back to the sport in June. F1 was one of the first sports back from the pandemic in June. Cricket and basketball had kind of led the way, but Formula One, to their credit, got it figured out and was one of the first sports back in a world that needed some entertainment, I think, after a horrible few months. And unfortunately, it really didn't go to plan in the sense of
not everybody bought in, whether it was stakeholders, participants, and fans. And I think it sucks that I have to look back when the hashtag #ReRaces1 campaign ended after 2021, and you kind of look at it and thinking, well, this ended up being another toothless slogan. Like I've seen a lot of anti-racism slogans from other forms of sport. And it shouldn't have been like that, man.
It's still one of my deepest frustrations and led to the most read article on our website's history. The one I wrote about the race, because if you fast forward a couple of months, we got to the British Grand Prix, and where the British Grand Prix, they had dedicated time towards a social justice message and a ReRaces1 unified grid message. And on that grid, 7 drivers refused to take the knee, which was the universally accepted gesture of supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. And a lot of people believed in as drivers that, we'd like to think, generally speaking, are good people, didn't for whatever reason, whether it was scared of offending people, confusion over the message, or just generally bad optics, refused to do it. As you said, RJ, the buy-in wasn't 100%. It was never 100%. I criticized Formula One at length for how badly botched the whole thing felt like. I remember Grosjean only wanted to do this for one Grand Prix, and Sebastian Vettel and Hamilton had to be like, no, what are we doing? We got to keep reinforcing this message. So everybody's vibes were off on this. No one had a clear idea of how to do this properly. They were trying to ask fans for money so they could put it towards social causes, but we never knew where that money was going. But hey, buy our £45 poster and we promise it will go to a good cause. Chase Carey put $1 million of his own money in the back pocket to his credit, but we never knew where that money went. I was one of the prominent black content creators, writers, journalists, whatever you want to call me, that spoke out about it. And it just never went anywhere. Within a year and a half, the whole message had lost its purpose. It just got blended into every big sports league's generic messages about sustainability and doing things for social causes. Like,
and all that stuff is good, but it completely diluted what this was supposed to be about at its outset. Now, I will say it wasn't like all of this wasn't a total waste, to be certain, because there were good initiatives that came out of this, meaningful initiatives that came out of this. Just the most visible portion of it, I don't know, man.
Yeah, it was a shame. There was some genuine good things that came off this. Formula One's TV coverage became a lot more diverse. People like Laura Winter and Ariana Bravo got their starts in the industry as a partial result of this. The sport did put a lot of money towards social change. There was more of a revamp towards grassroots motorsport and trying to be more diverse. Like, the message ultimately may have got lost, but there was some good there. But I still, to this day, wonder what Re-Racers 1 could have been and how it could have been so much more than what we actually got in the end, as the world eventually moved on and moving back to something resembling reality.
Or at least the reality that one once knew.
Yeah.
We did have real world racing in 2020, of course, and it led us to a very interesting title fight in the FIA Formula 3 Championship between two drivers who are in Formula 1 right now, and one of them who is pounding on the door. That would be Oscar Piastri, Logan Sargent, and Theo Pourchaire. Oscar had a tough weekend in Formula 3 one time. His DRS wing wouldn't open, and I evoked a phrase that was made popular by the WWE's New Day in a promo many, many years ago, cuffing season. And it has haunted me ever since. Oscar, if you're listening, I have the utmost respect for your abilities as a driver. I appreciate all the work that you put in this. I am sorry for denigrating one of your most frustrating weekends on your climb to Formula One into a sick joke for our own immature amusement.
Yeah, but it was funny joking about having the possibility of his penis getting stuck in a DRS wing. I mean, come on. We all found it funny. I know you all did, listeners, as well.
You found it the most funny. You were losing your shit more than any one of us on the call, man.
Because I didn't know what cuffing season was. It's not a British phrase. It was an American phrase, and you three all knew what it was, the whole, spring break, college vibe and all that, but we don't really have that. Okay.
No, but see, the thing is, that's like after fall. That's like shacking up with somebody in, like, the cold months, man.
Been there, done that, didn't know what it was called. So, yeah, that was a thing.
Oscar Piastri does come up later in this episode, but then we get to the emotional roller coaster fortnight in Bahrain that comes with multiple facets. Starting with the first Bahrain Grand Prix, where Romain Grosjean cheated death.
Still one of the most frightening incidents I've ever seen in an F1 race. I mean, I was sat in my bookies when that happened, and there was 25 of us in our Discord server watching along in shock and horror, where you watch that first run down to turn 3 on the opening lap of Bahrain, and in the background you see a literal fireball. Thinking, what the fuck has happened back there? And then we realize it's Romain Grosjean, who had been clipped, on the run down to turn 3, gone into a concrete barrier, and it split his car in half, ruptured the fuel tank. The whole thing goes up in flames, and we're thinking, shit, have we just watched a man die in real time? Thank Christ, only seconds later we see him jumping out of his car and being attended to by the medical team, who, props to them, they were there on the scene within seconds, and thank goodness, because those seconds, quite frankly, quite possibly saved his life. It was a horrifying accident, and again, somehow, this was the end of towards the end of Grosjean's time in Formula One.
This was Romain Grosjean's last act as a Formula One driver. He never comes back to this. He has a second career in IndyCar and sports cars after this.
Yeah.
It's a shame that it took this for a guy who had been punched down on for years as being nothing but an accident-prone waste of talent to finally get his flowers. And it's a shame that his IndyCar career hasn't really panned out the way that it should have done it from the start.
Yeah,
But
it sucks that it took that for us to finally have some empathy for the man, because he was a great driver. And the fact that he had 10 podium finishes is already in the top 1% of F1 drivers ever. But we are obsessed with memes and now that sort of in the moment kind of humor. And that became the punching bag for Grosjean for many, many years. And it took him nearly dying for us to realize that he was generally a sincere, well-liked, passionate racing driver who meant well and was generally very likable and very courteous. And it shouldn't have to come down to a guy leaping out of a fireball for it to get to that point. But unfortunately, that's how we are as sports fans.
And then that leads to the very next week, because as part of the complications of the onset of a global pandemic, Formula One had to get creative with its calendar. And one of the very creative things they did was having 2 races at Bahrain, one at the regular Grand Prix track and one around the perimeter circuit. This was the secure Grand Prix. And oh my God, this race had everything highlighted by George Russell's first true moment of F1 glory, because he's tapped to replace Lewis Hamilton, who got COVID the week of the race, and Sergio Perez, who was at risk of being out of the sport entirely in a race where he was caught up in a first lap accident, coming back to win his first race.
Yeah, an incredible sequence of events. Hamilton gets COVID. George Russell has to, the grace of Williams, has to fill in for Lewis Hamilton, the guy that we all thought might get his seat eventually anyway. The real smoking gun, is George Russell really that good? Turns out, yes, he actually is. He actually is that good. He was the best driver at the Bar Rhombus that weekend. He probably should have won that race that weekend, but ultimately it wasn't to be. The confusion of the pit stops and the puncture that Russell suffered, it just wasn't his day. I'd argue that actually probably made him look a little bit stronger that he didn't win that race at a canter, because the fact he came back and still nearly won it anyway until the pit stop errors that Mercedes had. But the other story of that was Sergio Perez, a man who was on the brink of losing his job in Formula One. He had been replaced by Sebastian Vettel already. He was the last guy on the grid. We didn't know who his future was going to be. He was taken out at turn 1, and he was collected in that Verstappen-Leclerc incident on the opening lap, and came back from the back of the field to win. In his first career win, the second longest anyone had ever had to wait in their career for their first win. I think it was his 160th Grand Prix or something silly like that for Checo when that first win finally came. A decade long of being the contender, or being the guy that was the plucky underdog, finally got his moment in the sun. An amazing feel-good moment for an amazing team that was on the brink of collapse earlier that year. And there were Force India, there were then Racing Point by the time we got to that race. An incredible all-round weekend and story, and what racing needed after that horrible near miss with Grosjean the week prior.
Oh, yeah. That was memorable. And I say this as a Sergio Perez fan. Look, last year was not great, but I think the build-up to all of that was very, very much worth it. That's why I love Formula One sometimes, man. 2021 in particular was not a good year for motorcycle racing. We lost a lot of young riders in really tragic accidents, none more so than Jason Dupasquier, who was riding in Moto 3 until he perished in a practice accident that would really set the tone for like a lot of sadness in the motorcycle racing community.
We lost 3 in that, and that's just in the MotoGP ladder alone, really, that year, with Dean Berta Vinales and Maverick's cousin. You may know Maverick Vinales, his cousin passed away. Hugo Milan as well passed away. He was 14 in a practice crash, and this was the first one. This was the day before the Indy 500 as well. Just a somber weekend across the whole. It was that Moto 3 weekend in Mugello, and again, it was in qualifying, funnily enough, as well. It was a pack of riders trying to set a qualifying lap, and Dupasquier loses control as he goes over the second Arabato, and next thing you know, well, again, this happened live. I saw it in real time. It's another one of those memories that I wish I could erase, but it will forever be etched in my head. And unfortunately, because back then Dorna were even clumsier with the way they broadcasted these sorts of incidents, we saw him having CPR in real time on the side of the track as it was happening. Just horrible incident to watch. And then waking up the following morning and finding out that he succumbed to his injuries was just deeply sad and deeply tragic, and it set the tone for just a lot of hard conversations about lightweight motorcycle racing, pack racing, following each other, and eventually the age limit changes that are now coming into effect in the biking ladder now, and the whole idea that maybe this is more of a cover-up towards making sure that children aren't the ones that are dying in these incidents. It was 2021 was a very dark year for bike racing. It was a horrible year for bike racing, and a lot of very difficult conversations had to be had at the time. No more than unfortunately the first one of 3 major fatalities in the biking world that year. Jason Dupasquier was one of them. Just horribly sad.
I mean, it's a hard sport to watch, man. It's an awesome sport to watch, but like sometimes it can be very, very sad because you're not strapped into anything. You don't have seatbelts on. You are the crash structure sometimes. And like, it wasn't the last time we had like tough conversations. Like the Almentoris Trophy came back, and it was a grim year where now we have discussions of like, should this continue on? I remember 2021, I felt like especially when the voices were from the loudest from the people who don't watch motorcycle racing, that we're getting like the wrong conclusion. It's not just about the fact that like, hey, we have riders under the age of 16. It's the fact that these riders from the ages of 15 to 21 or however old are racing too gosh darn close to one another, and this needs to stop. I don't know. It's just sad.
Incredibly sad.
Now, we've also covered Formula E throughout the history of our podcast. We've had a number of guests talk about it, from Hazel Southwell to Sasha Garlick. Back during 2020, we had Tempelhof Nights, where we all sat around and watched all 6 Berlin E-Prix races. Again, another legacy of the first era of the pandemic calendars. And then also, our very own Reinhard King Cam Buckley got to go to the New York City E-Prix in 2021, where they got to watch electric racing cars, and also got to see a guy doing dual-wielding swordsman bullshit on an MTA subway while being a menace to the public. I don't know. It was all very weird.
Yeah, it was hearing about a sword fight take place in the New York subway the same weekend this was happening was quite the trip. And I wasn't even the one there. It was King, it was Cam, and yeah, just an incredible vibe in the weirdest possible way, and just weird seeing Formula E cars race around New York and the river on the side as well as it was all going down. It kind of, especially as a guy that's now since been to New York and actually recognized part of it now from that race weekend. It had many a crazy moment in Formula E, but none crazier than a dual-wielding swordsman on a subway train.
Also, Matsi Gunter and Sam Bird won those 2 races in New York City. A track that's no longer on the calendar. Man, I just think Formula E has had opportunities. It's had some great moments, but I also just think like there's so many missed opportunities, whether it's like, for me, it's making Switzerland the centerpiece event, a time when ICE Motorsport wasn't really allowed. It didn't work out like that. We got Monaco instead. That's great. A lot of manufacturers left, a lot of really good drivers left, a lot of interest left. It's still great when it wants to be. I don't know. Should we talk about the time where we had a standing race start with only 1 car in the grid?
We probably should. I mean, yeah, God, the Hungarian Grand Prix of 2021. And what a race that was, from the bowling ball starts, and back yesterday we had the track dry up. We had the 1 car standing restart because this was one of the first major times we had the rule of cars, and the race direction can make them restart on the race grid again, like normal, purely for entertainment purposes. Everybody dives into the pits, realizing the track's dry enough for slicks, except for Lewis Hamilton, who's then has to come around for a lap on intermediates that are overheating, and then chase down the field in what ended up being one of the best races of the hybrid era. An epic where Hamilton has to scythe through the field like a man possessed. But then, as the way it all shook out, Esteban Ocon and Sebastian Vettel have an epic fight for the win. All of that alongside Hamilton gunning them down at 4 to 6 seconds a lap by the end of that race. Fernando Alonso putting in a defensive job of the gods to hold Hamilton back as long as he possibly could, trying to hold him off, knowing his teammates challenging for the win. And eventually Hamilton coming up just a couple of laps short. And yeah, Latifi in the points as well, as JB quite rightly points out.
Yeah, that was one of the
points.
Both Williams at a points. After a year in which they went scoreless, the team was sold from the Williams family to an administrative group that we all thought was going to be the curtains for the team. And as it turns out, no, there is signs of life at Williams, and they have been on an upswing ever since.
Not to mention,
that was so. Yeah,
not to mention Sebastian Vettel finishing second, but then being disqualified because there was a hole in his fuel tank. That was brutal in that sense as well. And that was the same weekend he brought out the rainbow shirt and took a stand against Orban's horrible anti-LGBT plus legislation that he was trying to put through in Hungary at the time. And one of those prominent quotes I remember, because there was rumors that he might be punished for wearing that T-shirt and breaking protocol pre-race, and Vettel distinctively on F1 TV to the camera said, "Disqualify me then." He did not care if his second place was going to be taken away from him and he had to give his trophy back for the stand that he took. One of the most powerful recent gestures of Formula One and social change in recent times. The transformation of Seb was quite one to behold. We'll get to that in a little bit as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And as an Esteban Ocon fan who'd been following his career since his Formula 3 days, that was vindication. That was another chance, another reminder that hey, Fernando Alonso, even coming back off a long hiatus from Formula 1, has still got those killer instincts. That was another reminder that Sebastian Vettel still has what it takes to compete at the highest level. And it was a reminder that Esteban Ocon can hack it, that he's not just a favor for the French shareholders. And yeah, even if it does turn out to be his only win, it was a very special one. Shout outs as well to to Pierre Gasly as well for his win in 2020 in Italy. That was really cool too. Again, if it turns out to be his only win, what a win it was.
Yeah, a remarkable redemption story in its own right for Pierre Gasly as well, after, shall we say, a difficult path to get to that point in his career. My goodness. What a journey it had been.
And we almost had another first-time winner later that year, because it all comes full circle. We come to the last Russian Grand Prix because of Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine. It could have been Lando Norris's first. It ended up being Lewis Hamilton's 100th.
probably the best of all the Russian Grand Prix races we had in the end.
The bar is subterranean, man.
I mean, yeah, I'm not saying that's a high mark, but hey, a good race is a good race, and yeah, like a race that looked like it was going to be another DRS train, and Lando Norris comfortably leading an F1 race for the first time in his career, and Hamilton eventually breaks free from that train and gets up to the back of Lando. But Mercedes' biggest weakness, they always struggled in following other cars in that dirty air era. And then with 10 laps to go, the rain comes down. And I remember watching this race at friend of the show Zoe Hamilton's house in Scotland, and just watching the chaos unfold in real time and thinking, is this going to get wet enough for intermediates? Turns out it did. Hamilton was the first to blink. Lewis out, like Lando Norris went for glory, trying to stay on the slicks as late as he dared, knowing he was only 3 laps from his first win, and it ended up not happening for him. And Hamilton instead would come through and take his 100th Grand Prix victory. They break out the special graphics. It's win number 100. Woo! You never thought you'd see a 100-win driver in Formula One history after Michael came so close with 91. But
yeah, let's not forget, we never thought anybody would touch Michael Schumacher's 91 wins.
I once did a video for Racewall TV saying that was the most unbreakable record in Formula One history, was Michael getting into Michael's 91 wins, because of just how ridiculous it was. The idea of averaging 5 wins a season for 18 seasons just to get to 90. I thought, no one's ever touching this again, because no one is that good in F1 for that long. Lewis Hamilton proved me wrong. Not the first time he's done that.
No, it's crazy. And foreshadowing stuff to come later on, Max Verstappen comes from last to finish second, and now we really have a championship fight. I'm going to talk about something as well, because again, we mentioned like every time NASCAR had gotten on the show, it seems like it was scandalous or tragic reasons. We talked about my ex-girlfriend's a trained assassin. We didn't talk about Ryan Newman having a brutal crash at the 2020 Daytona 500 and us fearing that he'd been killed.
Horrible crash.
We hadn't talked yet about on this episode about Kyle Larson joining a pickup sim race with other real-world racing personalities and uttering out a racial slur. So it seemed like, and then of course, like when NASCAR comes back, there's the news in Bubba Wallace's garage stall. Ugh. It seemed like every time we talked about NASCAR, something bad was happening. I want to talk about all the times where good stuff happened. Bubba Wallace getting his first win in Cup at Talladega Superspeedway, the same place where the Newts incident happened. How about Ross Chastain's Hail Melon at Martinsville, one of the signature moments of sports recent history, and now the new namesake of our Overtaking the Year trophy. And Shane Van Gisbergen winning on debut in a street race in Chicago that almost didn't happen because of the weather.
It's moments like that eventually made me a NASCAR fan, because I now actually watch every race. It's kind of weird how these things turn out over the years, because I was not a NASCAR guy until about 3 years ago, and yet here we are now. We've covered NASCAR sporadically in our show's history, but you're right. Most of it was for the wrong reasons in a lot of our earlier times. And it was actually a genuine pleasure to be able to start covering the sport in a more positive light. Bubba Wallace becoming just the second black driver in NASCAR history to win a National Series race, and one of the big ones at Talladega as well. Only a couple of years after his noose incident was found in the garage, and again, him being a kind of a symbol for a changing of the culture in NASCAR.
Absolutely. I thought it was awesome that like NASCAR was like setting arguably a better example for like turning things around in terms of racial equity than Formula One was, man. Yeah, NASCAR, the redneck sport.
Yeah, the redneck sport, the reputational redneck, deep southern sport that banned the Confederate flag the moment they realized what was going on with him and the noose in the garage, that had the incredibly powerful moment of the entire grid walking Bubba's car to his spot before the race had even started, and the camaraderie between the entire paddock in that moment, and even changing the mind of Richard Petty, the king himself, King Richard I, who at one point said anyone who doesn't stand for the national anthem will be fired, into seeing what a powerful symbol Bubba had been for change and changing his mind, something we need to do for so many white people of his age. And we forget, I think he was 83 years old at that point.
Yeah.
And this was a guy that, you could understand how a lot of older white folks wouldn't be so swayed and be dead set in their ways at that age and that point in their life. And he changed his mind because of Bubba Wallace and seeing what the man had to go through. So that was a powerful moment. Ross Chastain with the video game move turned real in Martinsville. The move we've all tried, the move we've all played on an F1 game, where you want to go around Monaco's walls and you think, just ride the wall, we've got damage off, it's fine. And actually turning that into not only the greatest overtake in modern NASCAR history, but also one that got him into the next round of the playoffs at Denny Hamlin's expense.
The final round, man. The championship 4 round. He didn't win the championship in the end, but Ross Chastain made a lot of fans of that moment. And he was always an easy driver to like, because who doesn't love someone who comes from the humble beginnings of a watermelon farmer? And I know this used to be the sport where people used to do that, but now it's a lot of well-off rich kids that get in NASCAR nowadays. Not Ross Chastain. He had to work and scratch and claw for every opportunity he had. And he's done it.
Indeed. And then a true crossover moment of Shane Van Gisbergen becoming the first NASCAR driver in 60 years to win on his debut in the Cup Series. What a moment that was. And what a moment for NASCAR that they were able... This race almost didn't happen in Chicago. It ended up being a rousing success.
Yeah. We did have to take some time off the end of it for reasons. There was some carnage. But, at the end of the day, it was an event that I think a lot of people didn't want to go off and be a success. See also Las Vegas Grand Prix, but it ended up being pretty awesome, especially for that moment. And now we have Shane Van Gisbergen. It's crazy. 2 of the defining stars of supercars in the 2010s are now making a solid living in America. Scott McLaughlin in IndyCar, Shane Van Gisbergen now beginning his NASCAR career.
Indeed, very much so. Next on the list, the 2021 United States Grand Prix, one of the genuine better races in F1's hybrid era, but also one marked for a very special reason, because a certain co-host of mine was there in person. Isn't that right, RJ O'Connell?
Yeah. This is about this time where I was starting to get big boy jobs, and people were trusting me to be on assignment for Formula races. I got a gosh dang Formula One media pass for this event. I got to sit in on all the interview sections. I got to sit in on all the press conferences. I got to do the post-session scrums. That was a real eye-opener. That was when I changed from blogger to actual reporter and journalist. I don't think I will forget that for a long, long time. And I feel very fortunate to have done so. And it also happened that this was a really, really great race.
Yeah, it helps. But again, another chapter in the book of M101 goes on the road somewhere, and just saluting the fact that we were actually starting to get our footholds out here in this game. It was remarkable in that sense. And a very, very cool moment indeed. And it was a great race. Well, that was one of the last real proper Hamilton versus Verstappen proper tiffs over the course of that season, where they were within a second of each other for the whole back half of that race, and Max held on for the win. And that was one of those key races in that feud, because a lot of people thought that was the end of the title fight right there and then, that because Max had held Lewis off and Lewis couldn't find a way past him, Max was going to go on and win the title, which he did, but not in the way that anybody would expect, because next on our list is indefensible. Abu Dhabi 2021. Man, and we are coming off of an inaugural Saudi Arabian Grand Prix where the vibes were just weird, to say the least. There was a very contentious incident between our title rivals, but it sets up dead level going into the final race, a reconfigured Yas Marina circuit where you just feel like maybe we might have an entertaining Abu Dhabi Grand Prix to decide a championship. If you don't know the story, it's been told many times before.
Hamilton dominates much of the early stages of the race. There is a crash that happens between backmarkers Nicholas Latifi and Nick Schumacher. It's not their fault any of this happens. Verstappen pits for tires. Hamilton stays out. But it looks like, this race is going to finish under safety car, and Lewis Hamilton is going to win his 8th Formula One World Championships until there's a call from race control that the race will restart with 1 lap to go. Verstappen charges through on fresh tires to overtake Lewis Hamilton and win his first championship. And the way we talk about motorsport has never been the same.
This was, for me, the embodiment of everything bad about Formula One in the space of... I look back on it now. The last 2 months of this season was rough.
Yeah, I think the U.S. Grand Prix, the U.S. race, the COTA race was probably the bright spot.
Yeah, that was the peak for me, because the back end of that season was tough. Brazil was rough, with Hamilton's car being DQ'd in qualifying for a DRS flap that was 0.5 millimeter too big. And
the push-off.
The push-off from Max to defend his position that took 3 days to settle because they didn't have the onboard footage working. And how Hamilton's incredible comeback was marred by that moment. And then Saudi Arabia, the plea deal in the pits with Michael Massey, and then the brake check from Verstappen trying to play DRS chess and getting cute about it as they for fighting each other. It was we haven't even mentioned Monza and the Rule 34 joke we made on the show about how Hamilton ended up with his car almost crushed by Max overhead. Thank God for the halo, etc. It was a rough 2 final months of that season, and then for it to end the way it did in Abu Dhabi, where Michael Massey ultimately has to fall on his sword for being too lost in the source of entertainment, which I think was an ongoing problem with his overall presidency as lead steward and race director. Because you forget 2021, there was also Spa and the breaking of force majeure to try and get a race off. There was Baku and the 2-lap restarts. And just general inconsistency in steward calls overall the course of that season. It all exploded into that one final incident. And I can only echo what RJ said at the end. The way we've discussed Formula One on the internet as a platform since has never, ever been the same.
Yeah. The hero and the villain of the story in a lot of people's eyes is cleared up. Hamilton was the guy just a year ago who was standing up for the right things. Max Verstappen was apathetic. And to a lot of people, it felt like the bad guys had won and that the game was always rigged from the beginning. I don't know, man. I kind of sympathize, but in a way, I just feel like... Well, we've never had it as good ever since. We've never had a title tilt this entertaining.
But at what cost?
Ever since. Verstappen has since gone on to be the dominant driver in the sport of the 2020s. And we wonder if Hamilton's ever going to get another opportunity to a title. I don't know, man. It was a lot to take in. Speaking of a lot to take in, the vibes at the Jeddah Corniche circuit were off the second time we visited in 2022. We had a missile strike, a 32G qualifying crash involving Mick Schumacher, or sad things didn't plan out in Formula One, and DRS vibes. Pretty entertaining race, but man, a missile strike? You're a Formula One race?
Again, everything good, bad, and indifferent about Formula One in the space of one weekend, in the sense of people went, I'd argue this was also the peak of the calling out sports washing vibe in sports that was going on, because later on that year we'd have a World Cup right next door in Qatar where Lionel Messi finally achieves his ultimate dream of winning the World Cup while having a sheath put over his head as he goes to lift the trophy, which just kind of sums up how everybody felt about that World Cup. This was our version of that in 2022. A lot of people, it was a horrible weekend to cover because of the
we were talking driver strike. It didn't pan out like that, but that was the most juice that argument had had for a long time.
Yeah, it was a lot of misinformation doing the rounds because people did not understand the Saudi Houthi rebel conflict of the time, the genuine fear about the possibility of the safety of the Grand Prix being compromised and wondering whether we should run this race at all, and the understandable fear that came with it. The fact that there was question marks about this track after Mick Schumacher hits a concrete wall at 32 Gs and was ruled out of the weekend with it via injury, and wondering, holy shit, should we be racing around a street circuit with concrete walls that has an average speed of 155? Maybe not the best idea in hindsight. And then DRS chess between Verstappen and Leclerc in what ended up being one of the best races of 2022 in general, and the first sign that, hey, maybe we got a title fight on our hands, until we didn't. It was a wacky Grand Prix weekend, and not in a good way. It was chaos. There was deep questions asked of the entire sport at large, from the safety aspect to the sports washing aspects of it, which we've kind of given up that fight when it comes to social media and when it comes to talking about it, because every sport has now embraced Qatar and Saudi Arabia in some capacity. We're snooker fans. We're watching a 167 max break tournament go down with a $500,000 bonus prize in Saudi Arabia as we speak.
167 max break? That's crazy.
Yeah, a golden ball that's worth 20 points. So if you get an extra...
Bro, no way. They are not doing They're not doing the Baseball United thing in snooker now.
Yeah,
Stop.
They are.
Oh, God.
Yeah, side note real quick. Yeah, they've added an extra ball to the table where if a player goes for a 147 break, they've added a golden ball to the top of the table next to the cushion, where if the player pots that golden ball, they get a straight up $500,000 bonus. Hence why they call it the Riyadh Masters of Snooker 167, because that's the new maximum break for that one-off tournament. Don't you just love Saudi Arabian sports events? It's great.
The 2022 British Grand Prix was a weekend that showcased the good, the bad, and the ugly of motorsport. Carlos Sainz Jr. won his first Formula One race in one of the few happy moments for Ferrari in the year that would be synonymous with Hans, the weird-looking horse that is all fucked up in many ways. I think another example of this is like Charles Leclerc's primal scream when he crashes out of his other home race in Paul Ricard. But this was also a race that was built into with the background of Nelson Piquet Sr.'s very terrible comments about Lewis Hamilton coming to light, Yuri Vips saying a racial slur in a Twitch stream and losing out on his Red Bull Jr. gig. There was an interview that didn't really get much traction from Jamie Chadwick where she quietly embraced the awful gender critical movement. And we all just kind of brushed that aside because, like, hey, Jamie Chadwick's our best hope for a woman in Formula One right now. We can't kick her down the ladder for that. And then also on top of that, Ryan King, our dear friend Ryan King, goes off to that big house of blogs in the sky, and he's no longer a full-time host of our show.
One of the genuinely most emotional weekends I can remember covering Motorsport 101 ever. Because those who don't know me very well, I write a review of the race and the week's action on the website every time there's a major racing event. I scrapped that for this weekend because there was so much horseshit regarding Nelson Piquet Sr.'s dug-up comments from 2022 about Lewis Hamilton that were racist, and Jamie Chadwick, who gave off big turf energy in regards to the gender-critical movement.
That's trans-exclusive radical feminist, but there's nothing radical or feminist about it, sorry.
Right, that's absolutely worth pointing out, and, it's a phrase you probably shouldn't use for that very reason, because it's nothing feminist about it as far as we're concerned. But, yeah, just leaning into Caitlyn Jenner's similar views about mixed gender competition and that, there's no place for trans people in sports despite being a trans athlete herself, which is just, it was a horrible weekend. And then, dealing with King going to Jalopnik on top of that as well. And again, we can only speak glowingly of Ryan Eric. And he's a part-time guest with us now. But King was the engine room that made this show go. He's always had the best interests of this show in heart. I'll let you in on a little secret. The Riverside room we're recording this in right now, he still pays for out of the goodness of his heart to support us. He has been on the third most amount of shows than anyone in history. He had been there right from the very start. He was a guy that I joked once I blocked on Twitter for being too much of a smartass, and he would become one of my best friends, and the guy that I started this journey out with 9 years ago, and we'd known each other for 11 years before that, because he had his own podcast as well that I was a part of, and we just worked together. And Motorsport 101 is just as much as his creation as it is mine, and I owe him so much for that. And we're still lucky we get to use him and share his expertise now, because he's one of the most disciplined, level-headed, but great journalists, content creators, writers, whatever he's put his mind to, he does it exceptionally well, with a touch of class, with a touch of maturity and nuance that so many that I could never have as a journalist. I'll be openly admit, I am a loose cannon when it comes to the way I get down as a writer and broadcaster. I openly admit this. Some people like that. A lot of people don't. King is everything great about this show, and again, we would not be doing this if it wasn't for him. No, and again, immensely proud of him that he's able to keep doing that for Jalopnik, and
I'm proud to call him a friend, man. Like, even if it's just like, if we're hanging out in Discord, whether it's watching NASCAR, learning about sailboat racing, or just whatever comes to mind that he's like research or talk about, like, that's some of the best moments that I have as part of this podcast. And like, I'm so glad to have gotten to work with him. We still do from time to time, man.
Yeah, absolutely. An incredible journalist, an even better person. And we're very lucky to. He's been the backbone of our history.
Next up on the list is the 2022 Indy Toronto, which was a race that Scott Dixon won. But we're not talking about that, because this was about the time where reigning IndyCar Series champion Alex Palou had broken IndyCar silly season, the first time. The revelation that he was breaking off on his contract to go to McLaren, and just us going, what in the fuck is going on here? And the eventually Chip taking his own driver to federal court over it. It got litigious. There was weekly rumors of, is he going to be put on gardening this week? Well, how about next week? Well, how about the other?
And not only, let's not forget, he was the reigning IndyCar Series champion at this point.
Yeah. The reigning series champion who'd broken out in a big, big way ever since coming over from Japan to America. As somewhat of an unknown his first year, he is a dynamo out of the box at Ganassi, wins a championship his first year with the team, and you're thinking, how could this all possibly go wrong? And so we thought it was all going terribly wrong in the summer of 2022. And this would also inform something that happens in episode 384, which I completely forgot to note happened on this episode, but it informs the eventual contract dispute involving Oscar Piastri, Alpine, and McLaren, because this sets a precedent for the driver to reject his then employer to go sign a new deal with McLaren.
Yeah, it ties into 464 from a year and a half or so ago as well, where it's just... Alex Palou single-handedly broke 2 IndyCar silly seasons purely because of his inability to understand how a contract works. And yeah, just look, we love Alex Palou. Like, not so much me, but even RJ and Cam was endorsing just how quality this dude was years before he'd even rolled up in IndyCar. And yeah, everything he said about Palou turned out to be true from a talent standpoint, but my gosh, he done goofed. And I remember the first time this had happened. I remember Marshall Pruitt writing mailbag columns about this, and as recently as the last race of the season in Laguna Seca, a race that he would go on to dominate and win by 30 seconds, that they were going to peel the number 10 off that car the moment it was over. 3 days later, I'm back for next year. Cool.
It's amazing, but then he gets to have his cake and eat it too. Let's tick off 464 a bit, because as that year goes on, it's like, yeah, he gets to have his cake and eat it too. He gets to have F1 testing opportunities at McLaren. He gets to have another season at Chip Ganassi. Eventually goes on to win his second championship. We all just think, right, at the end of this year, he's going to McLaren Indy. And then he breaks things off because the promises that were made to him, in his mind, were not what was going to be. And so he decides to break things off with McLaren and stay at Chip Ganassi.
Yeah, a remarkable moment indeed. And yeah, 2022 was a chaotic year in general. And a lot of that silly season also started out by a moment that we never quite thought would see happen. Sebastian Vettel joins Instagram.
Yeah, he joins Instagram.
The one driver on the grid who had no social media whatsoever. He vowed he would never get on social media.
So what's he cooking up here? His retirement at the end of the 2022 season. And this kicks off everything because it leads to Fernando Alonso jumping ship to take his seat. It leads to the fiasco and the tweet heard around the world. It leads to so much, but like, okay, Dre, you're the Sebastian Vettel guy. We talked about the transformation from prospect to champion who ruins all the fun through his smothering dominance. The guy at Ferrari who could always get close but could never quite make it to the people's champion on the way out of F1.
It's a remarkable journey for a guy that I don't think anybody ever thought was going to have the legacy and career that he ended up walking away from Formula One with. Sebastian Vettel he grew up on a farm. He was a small town guy. He got to Formula One, immediately showed off his very British sense of humour, his love of the Beatles, of Michael Jackson. Sadly, Little Britain. We don't talk about that show. It was a terrible show, but, you know, I'm glad they got the laugh out of people back then. No, I'm not. I'm joking. It was fucking terrible, but we'll ignore that. We'll say Monty Python instead and play it safe. But that's the point. That's besides the point. He becomes Formula One's youngest ever race winner for a good while until Verstappen rolled up. He still is the youngest ever Formula One world champion at just 23, seemingly out of nowhere, and he became sort of the panto villain of Formula One for the majority of his prime, as being the guy we love to hate because we couldn't relate to this dark-haired German fella who actually had a great sense of humor and was actually incredibly likable. We just didn't want to like him back then because he kept winning all the goddamn time.
Nobody likes a winner.
Even though his period of dominance wasn't actually all that dominant. Weird how these things turn out. But then, for me, the transformation happened when he was at Ferrari, where he was now the antagonist and not the protagonist. And he was the thorn in the side of that dominant Mercedes team for so long. He was the guy that was getting up in their grills, giving them something to think about, stealing the occasional win off them. And I think a lot of people saw this more light-hearted, funny guy that wasn't taking himself too seriously, but also becoming a more relaxed, becoming a dad, just becoming a more likable, well-rounded figure in F1. And by the time he got to Aston Martin, a guy that had genuinely stuck his neck out for being Lewis Hamilton's greatest ally in the paddock and the only other guy that had the genuine Black Lives Matter hashtag on his race helmet, the guy that had become an advocate for the environment, for climate change, for the LGBT plus community, and just in general becoming a wonderful ambassador for Formula One and leaving F1 with arguably the greatest send-off a driver has ever had in this sport. A guy that got a guard of honor on his final race, tribute helmets from Fernando Alonso, once his greatest nemesis on the grid, the guy that couldn't believe this German fella had come along and stolen his glory.
Gosh darn special intro to his last race where ahead of the reigning world champion, he's the last man you see on the Formula One intro with a B-roll shot they didn't use all year.
Yeah, a video tribute on the way to what was him being allowed to do donuts on the start finish and getting a post-race interview, which is normally only reserved for the podium sitters. And even then, the most disgustingly humble man in F1 still used that last opportunity to say, I hope my legacy can continue, and I hope drivers continue to stick up for what they feel is important and continue to advocate for change. And a helmet that was raised hundreds of thousands of euros for charity because fans are allowed to be on his final helmet, the last lap, by Sebastian Vettel. It's actually quite remarkable that he ended up walking away from this sport, one of the most universally well-liked drivers this sport has ever had. It's actually, I'd argue, given how big of a villain and how much of an anti-hero he was in the first chunk of his career, I don't think he could leave with a greater legacy than that.
I agree. It's like it would make a perfect episode for the Secret Base series Prism, where they, examine the very complex legacies of certain athletes. But I'll put a pin in that, but I'll get to that later because I want to talk about our 400th episode. We did special episodes. On episode 300, we talked about the people making content in and adjacent to the racing world that we like. Some of them are still going on. Some of them have stopped. But there is one person still enduring in episode 400, just not in the career that we know him for. Valentino Rossi, our retrospective on the Doctor. Because contrary to popular belief, we do have appreciation for the man.
MotoGP isn't what it is without him. I still grew up in a time when World Superbikes was the number one bike racing series in the world, when it was riddled with Carl Fogarty and then Colin Edwards and Troy Bayliss and Noriyuki Haga and Troy Corsa and Frankie Keeley and all those guys that made World Superbikes what it was in the late 90s, early 2000s, until Valentino Rossi came along. And Valentino Rossi single-handedly changed bike racing forever. He was the lightning rod that put MotoGP back on the map, that put prototype bike racing eventually back on the map. From his ridiculous celebrations, his unmatched levels of charisma, and his rancorous ability to piss off anybody within 20 feet of him at a certain point or another, with his just a completely unafraid, abashed personality. And then, of course, winning a shitload of races and championships to back that up. 9 in total, 7 in the top flight. A record that still hasn't been topped to this day. Valentino Rossi redefined not only the state of bike racing, but also what it meant to be a charismatic athlete in a sport, a transcendent figure, one of the first that motorsport has ever really had in this modern era. That final weekend in Valencia in 2022 was like the whole sport bent the knee for him. Like they repainted the Valencia wall in his honor. It's still there to this day. But like, even if you are not a bike fan, even if you are not a bike racer, you have heard of Valentino Rossi. You have remembered that yellow 46 that has become arguably the most iconic brand in all of motorsport. You recognize what the Doctor was to MotoGP and his ultimate legacy of bike racing. And I'm very proud.
I don't even think his legacy's not even finished, though, because of the VR46 Academy, his academy for training young riders who've since gone on to win races, to win championships in the sport. That's also huge. He's going to have an impact on four-wheel racing in his second career as a factory sports car racer for BMW. Like, he's bringing in audiences for support races and customer-centric GT championships that would never get the attention they otherwise would without Valentino freaking Rossi being a part of it, man.
100%. One of the most important modern figures that motorsport has ever seen, and a legacy that continues to this day, that not only can he say that he was the greatest bike racer that's ever lived, he's also produced via his academy another world champion in Francesco Bagnaia. They could have nearly had two with Frankie Morbidelli, who came so close in 2020. The legacy of the VR46 name and brand and academy continues. He has redefined what bike racing has become. What a time to do it.
Definitely. Dre, this last year was pretty big for you. If y'all hadn't heard, Dre was part of WTF1 throughout the 2023 season. It was met with some strange reactions at the beginning, but I'd like to think you absolutely crushed it. This was pretty big for you, man.
After, like, I've said it publicly since, but I was considering ending Motorsport 101 at the end of 2022. I genuinely thought I've taken this as far as I can go, and I felt like now was the time to put a neat little bow underneath it. And then Andrew Vanderbert, CEO of the race, sent me an email in October, and after some back and forth conversations and finding out that Tom Benningham and Matthew Gallagher had decided to walk away from WTF1, as well as Katie Fairman later on as well, I was one of the 4 new presenters they brought in for WTF1, and it's still the highlight of my career to date. And look, I've made no bones about talking about honest talk about how it ultimately didn't work out for me over there. And I'm still fun employed as we speak talking about it right now. But it was a life-changing career path for me, and it was the validation that I so badly needed in my career, because I always thought, am I good enough? Am I ever going to get to this point where someone takes me seriously enough that they want to actually pay me to do this, rather than just the honesty and kindness of some fans on social media who fell in love with what we do? It was a magical moment, and I'm very, very honored that they chose me for that role. And as much as it didn't work out, I'm very glad that it very much happened, because it changed me for the better, in that it gave me the confidence to think, yeah, I am good enough. Yeah, I do belong here, and I can do this.
Absolutely, man. And I think back to another moment, like, you got to go to the British Motorcycle Grand Prix for your old new job. Because, look, it can't just be me and King having all the travel time and the fun and the success out in the field. This is your thing, too. You earned this. Like, the only other time I think you'd gone as, like, a guest was, like, God, was it Brno pre-pandemic? And that was just as a guest on Monster Energy?
It was a guest of Monster as a competition prize. So this was the first time I'd actually been to a Grand Prix as a member of the media, and having a media pass and getting into the media center and walking shoulders with the journos that I'd admired as I grew into a journalist myself. Like, I got to hug Matt Oxley and say, hello, David Emmett from Motor Matters, and I spent the whole weekend sat next to Simon Patterson at the race, who is a fantastic journalist and reporter, and always has had his heart in the right place when it comes to getting the good out of bike race in the world that often hasn't let itself go down that road. And again, another one of those do I really belong here moments? And because I was sat on a bench next to Simon Patterson at the race, and then Megan White, who was at Autosport at the time, now with the race, ironically, herself, and her partner Lewis, who's I think he's still a part of Autosport now. So just feeling like I'd actually belonged. I was sat next to Matt Oxley for most of the weekend. It was just fucking crazy. I'm watching that man cook and talk, and the other side of the table is Lewis Sotheby, who's now their lead commentator, who's come such a long way, and Matt Burt, the other side of the table. Jack Appleyard as well from the Dorna broadcasting team was on the other side of my bench. It was just ridiculous to be there, but I felt like I belonged for the first time ever as a member of the media, and it was a phenomenal weekend racing. As a bonus, that was Alicia Spargaro winning on the final lap over Francesco Bagnaia in a damp Silverstone British Grand Prix, and a crazy weekend in that sense, and being in the garage, driving a car for the first time in my life, and it was one of the most batshit crazy weekend. So again, a salute to Matt Beer and Glenn Freeman at the race, who's had the idea to send me over there in the first place. I owe it all to them, especially Matt, because apparently it was Matt's idea. When I said it was Glenn's idea, Matt got very angry with me about that. But no,
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt and Glenn. They are great people at the race. Do not, I can't stress this enough, please do not boycott them or be mad at them just because they ultimately let me go. A lot of the middle management in that gig and a lot of the journos that work for them are tremendous people, and they deserve all the support they can get.
Absolutely.
And the majority of them are great, great people, and I was very, very lucky and fortunate to work with them for the year that I did. And they made me a better journalist and a better human being, so I'm very grateful for the experience.
Absolutely. Now, across Motorsport 101 history, we've always lamented, like, gosh, we should really get more guests. And, like, not just within our own bubble, but, like, outside our bubble. We had Nicky Hayden, of course. We had Jack Harvey. Last year, I brought in my friend Ruby Acosta to help bring some levity after some weird, hateful bullshit was going on in the racing world. All of that is really, really incredible. I'm thankful for everybody that's come on the show. I'm also really amazed that I got one of my favorite podcasters to be on this. And it kind of happened just sort of it was a perfect timing because Ryan Nanny used to work for SB Nation and Secret Base. And
who we're huge fans of here.
Yeah, who we're huge fans of here. Great, wonderful guy. And he had a challenge in 2023 as it was soon to be revealed that, hey, his old job was laying him off. He was going to be on as many podcasts as he possibly could. And I had an idea. Why don't we make ourselves one of the stops on this tour? And so we did. And it ended up being one of the most fun race reviews that we've had because Ryan, of all the people in the Shutdown Fullcast, is the least familiar with Formula One. Spencer Hall, the main host, is a regular contributor to ESPN's F1 pre-show coverage.
And Spencer Hall's the fucking man, by the way. He's incredible as a journo and broadcaster.
Wonderful,
huge fan.
Wonderful man as well. I've met him several times. But Ryan, I asked Ryan, hey, you want to come on? He's like, yeah, let's do it. It ended up being one of the most fun shows where we draw parallels from ball sports to Formula One. And this was back at a time where we had a shred of joy in this world about Formula One. Before it was all crushed in the smothering abyss of Red Bull Racing and the Honda Motor Company.
I did not know until minutes before we were recording that RJ had somehow pulled off getting Ryan Nanny on the show. So I was in shock that this was even happening. I got to show off my Dorktown poster on the wall behind me as we record this show. And obviously, I don't know how I felt about it because obviously he'd just been let go by them. And I'm just I promise this is not in bad faith. I'm just really, I found your work amazing. And I'm just saying that I appreciate it. I've genuinely got both Dorktown posters you sold. And I was a huge fanboy. And being able to just talk about Formula One and make it relatable to a guy that obviously had heard of F1, but obviously didn't know the nuances behind it. And it was just an incredibly fun episode. We laughed so hard doing that hour-and-a-half show on Bahrain, which was a boring race on paper, and yet we somehow found a way to have
stunk.
It was a horrible race, and yet we found a way to make it good. And again, Ryan Nanny's a fantastic guy, and one of my favorite guests we've ever had on the network. I'm very, very glad to have him on.
You know, Dre, we should get more guests on this year.
We really should. We say this every year, but we really should.
Yeah, man. I don't know. Just a couple last ones as we're kind of getting to the end of this. This is going to be our longest episode ever. It's 500 episodes. Can you tell?
Who cares?
The 24 Hours of Le Mans Centenary. This was a race where I learned how stuffy the Le Mans Media Center is, but just how spectacular the event is in person. Dre finally embraced the charm of endurance racing. You got it. You watch this sometimes. You said to yourself you weren't really a fan, but this was the event where you got it. And then, of course, everyone loves a NASCAR Cuppy car riding around with all these prototypes and purpose-built GT cars.
It was fun. It was just fun to watch it. It really was. And look, I've never disrespected the legacy of Le Mans and how powerful and how daunting an endurance race is. It's just something as a product that I've never been able to fully appreciate and digest. For some reason, 2023 was just the year that it clicked for me. I'd be thinking about sport, the nature of sport, and how enthralling it can be to have a multiple-day event. I'm a cricket fan. Cricket's one of my favourite sports, and the pinnacle of cricket is a 5-day contest, and yet somehow I didn't appreciate a 2-day event known as the 24 Hours of Le Mans. How silly am I? For my days of playing Gran Turismo, on the Gran Turismo 4 on the video games and driving all those incredible 1,000 horsepower prototypes from the Group C era and falling in love with that game series as a part or result of sports car racing. And then seeing Ferrari win their first major Le Mans race in 60 years of an incredible team of Collado, Pierre Guidi, and Antonio Giovinazzi, a guy that, didn't have the best run in F1, but got to be a hero for Ferrari and bring home one of their greatest honors in recent history. And also just the competitiveness of the field, the Garage 56 and the innovation of turning a NASCAR stock car into a genuinely great, viable GT was so much fun. I loved it, and it's the one that really clicked with me is just how great endurance racing can be. It was fantastic.
I'm so glad I got to be a part of that in person, and I hope this coming year, 2024, Le Mans 24, is just as good. And I think that if we have a last-minute balance of performance change that benefits the favorite manufacturer of a certain co-host of ours who is not present, he doesn't get to complain that a manufacturer lost or won this race just due to balance of performance and then poo-poo all over it.
Mm-hmm.
But I digress.
But we digress.
Most recently, 478. This was the episode where another of the founding writers of the run of the show did something we never thought we would. Marc Marquez left Honda.
Wow. After 11 years, 6 championships in the top flight, and the extra support from the days he was a teenager in Moto 3 and Moto 2. Actually, take that back, not even Moto 3. He never raced in Moto 3. It was the last year of the 125cc era, believe it or not. If I want to be technical with it. Marc Marquez. If Valentino Rossi was the biggest game changer in bike racing, Marc Marquez rewrote the rule book on how to ride a MotoGP bike. Like, his body out riding style, the ridiculously deep lean angles, the just complete lack of a fear of failure. His rookie season, he jumped off his motorcycle at 210 miles an hour at Mugello because he knew his brakes had failed. That kind of crazy bullshit that made Marc Marquez such a likable figure amongst the sport, but also just the greatest rider arguably Honda's ever had. And that's Honda, Mick Doohan Honda, the guy that broke bike racing over its knee in the 90s. Arguably, Marquez has got a greater legacy at Honda than Mick Doohan does. And after 11 years, a horrifying arm break injury and the complications that came with it, that took a whole year to fix, and 4 surgeries, one that almost ended his career, and losing 4 years of his prime, he's finally decides to walk away from Honda, leaving a bucket load of money on the table to go to Ducati and ride for Nadia Panavani's Gresini team. Truly an eye-popping moment. It was on the level of Valentino Rossi walking away from Honda to go to Yamaha in 2003, and just soaking in one of the most historic biking moves of all time. Marquez's legacy is almost blown by, and we're still waiting. We could still be seeing a second chapter of that now in blue rather than orange, but it was a move that we'd seen fall apart in real time over as the years had gone by, and just the startling nature of it all.
I mean, we could not have a recount of the most important moments of the show and not talk about Marc Marquez. Marc Marquez has been a favorite of ours for this entire ride. We've been through all the highs, the oh my goodness, are you actually freaking kidding me moments that he's had when it was good. We were there when we thought the 2020 championship would be a formality, and it wasn't. And he lost 4 years of his prime. Somehow he still got intermittent wins when he was healthy and when his bike was up to task. But now we're seeing the second phase of his career, and he has an opportunity to do something very, very incredible. Put himself in even more rarefied air by winning with 2 different manufacturers.
Doesn't happen very often. Even fewer is the list of people that have won championships with 2 different manufacturers, and arguably Marquez's stiffest competition in the better part of a decade, going up against Francesco Bagnaia, the man that's spearheaded and redefined Ducati's presence in MotoGP, having won the last 2 championships, but he's not faced a rider of Marquez's level at 100% fitness yet, and that's going to be the biggest test of his career. It might be the biggest test of Marquez's career. What can he do on the Ducati? We'll know a lot about that this weekend when the 2024 season starts in Qatar.
Dude, it's crazy. Before we wrap things up, I want to ask you listening out there, was there a moment that we had missed? Leave us some feedback. If there's a moment that we left off, the 50 most important Motorsport 101 moments, we might make an appendix of other important moments that we missed out on this recording. As always, we welcome feedback. Hit us up on Twitter or Instagram or however you want to get in touch with us.
Yeah, we got one in his King's 10 out of 10 for Valtteri Bottas, and I think it was a 2018 season review was one of them that was in there. That's a very funny moment where King screwed up and gave his beloved Valtteri a 10 out of 10. That's a great moment right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. We left the 50th moment on the list for this, our 500th episode. And I very selfishly asked to have the floor on this one because I guess it comes down to me at the end of the day. This was a university project that got rapidly out of hand. And here I am, 9.5 years later, 500 episodes deep. And I think I've been on something like 470 of them. I've missed a few here and there due to work commitments and what have you, but it's been an incredible adventure. It's one that's defined my life over the last decade. All I've ever wanted to do was to entertain people, and I found that motorsport just happened to be my calling, whether it be via YouTube, whether it be via writing written articles and blogs, whether it be via this very medium you're listening in right now. And one of the greatest blessings of my life has been able to somehow convince so many amazing people to join me on this ride together over the last decade. People that I can call friends for life, people that I can say have become the lovers of my life in all of that. And it's been a remarkable journey to get to this point. There's been so many highs and so many crushing lows. The nature of being a motorsport fan itself, I think, comes with that difficulty of having to navigate the hard and deal head on with what makes being a motorsport fan so difficult, but also embracing the greatness of when everything comes together every once in a while and reveling in that greatness. And I've been so fortunate to have been able to share that with so many people. And I just want to say a few thank yous to a few special people out there. To all of my main staple hosts, to RJ O'Connell, of course, who has been here for 8 of those 9 years now and has been a remarkable human being and a great servant to this show and an even better friend. And I couldn't do it without him, without Ryan King, without Cam Buckley, without Adam Johnson. So many of our amazing guests that have gone on to wonderful things themselves that we're very proud to have had a part in. Krista Hardy, Matt Carnero, Lewis Sotheby, Remy Connors, Katie Fairman. So many amazing guests we've had over the years. We even had Shane Bear on here once. I mean, holy shit. Shane Bear is a fucking legend and one of the very, very good people in this space. And
he's back. He's back. Better than ever, baby.
He's back on Twitter, and I couldn't be happier that he's back and to face this cesspit together. And thanks to him, a huge thanks to some of the people that go under the radar that I don't talk about enough. Stephanie Hunter, who runs our website and has taken a huge amount of money off the table to be able to run our website as affordable as and to make it as affordable as she has done for so many years, but always one message away whenever I've needed something, whenever we've had the creative process to putting together a site and all the bells and whistles that come with it. She has done a remarkable job over the last decade plus of being able to do that and be also one of the best friends I could ever have. So Stephanie Hunter, thank you. I love you so much. A huge thank you to my mum, Denise, who has put up with so much of my shit over the years, late night recordings, losing sleep, to me recording with a bunch of Americans and the 5-hour plus time differences that comes with. She's been incredibly understanding and has never, ever, ever stood in my way of chasing this dream that eventually got to by being with WTF1 last year. And shout out to all you guys that have come over from WTF1 in that time. There's genuinely been an uptick since the end of last year. So thank you all for joining in. We really are glad you're here. To everyone in the M101 Discord server, and I know many of you are listening in right now as this is happening. Thank you for being my second family. And I mean that. I sincerely mean that. You guys make dealing with motorsport so much easier, so much knowledge, so much passion, so much goofy bullshit that goes on in that server. But I couldn't be prouder of the group of friends I've been able to call and family. And that Zoe Hamilton is listening in right now is one of the best friends I've ever had in my life. And I've known her for 10 plus years now. And I love her to death. I take a bullet for that woman. And again, so many people in that server that I'd be here for the next 5 minutes if I had to list them all off. But you know who you are. And thank you so much for being a part of this journey. Thanks to everyone who has ever backed us on Patreon. The fact that you guys think that we're worth financially supporting to the point where this podcast pays for itself. I am so grateful that you think we're worth your money as well as your time and effort. Thank you so much. Thank you to my partner, Gloria, who has been the most wonderful support in the most recent times. Who's been editing our videos, you may have noticed as well, more recently on our social media. Over the last year or so, and again has completely embraced what we're about and has been a 100% objectively supportive of us from the very fucking start of our relationship. And she's known me for a very long time, but I'm very, very lucky to have her in my life. Gloria, I love you and thank you. But most importantly, thank you all so much. Every single one of you who've listened to this show, whether it be once or 500 times. And this is the part where I'm going to get emotional now, because this is what I always do when these milestone numbers come up, because I can't fucking help myself. But thank you. It's an honor and a privilege that you've invited us into your homes, your cars, your gym routines, whatever it may be. I've said it 100 times. There are so many places you can get your motorsport news, especially now. The space and the genre has grown so much in the decade we've been together that there are now genuinely viable alternatives to the big places where you can get your motorsport news and coverage. And yet, despite all of that, you still choose us. And that means the world. It really does. That you want to invite us into your homes and lives to talk about the goofiest fucking sport in the world. And you choose to do it with me and RJ and Cam and everybody else that may involve. Whether it be one time or whether it be for the 500th. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart so much for making this a viable career for me. It really, really, it's the greatest legacy I've got from one of the greatest things in my life is this show. And I'm so very, very fortunate to be able to share it with so many great people. So thank you. We'll be back for episode 501, and I wish it was talking about something that was brighter and more positive, because it's the Bahrain Grand Prix. Shit. I wish it could be something a bit more positive, but hey, that's the motorsport world we live in. And I just want to say on behalf of me, and RJ O'Connell, Cam Buckley, and everyone at Motorsport 101, thank you once again so much for listening to us and supporting us all the way. Here's to the next 500. I've been Dre Harrison. He's been RJ O'Connell. Thank you so much for listening. And here's to the next 500. Sayonara.
Where do we go?